My son-in-law slapped a piece of paper on my kitchen table and demanded $1,555 a month for me to live in my own guest house. My daughter stared at the floor, avoiding my eyes entirely. I just smiled, slid my coffee cup over his ridiculous lease agreement, and prepared to show them exactly whose name was on the master deed for the entire estate. Before I tell you how I tore their entitled lives down to the studs, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned and not simply inherited. My name is Tyrone. I am 69 years old, and until that freezing Tuesday morning, I actually believed my family was my sanctuary. I was sitting at my small wooden table in the guest house enjoying my black coffee. The winter air outside was biting, but inside I felt warm and secure. That peace shattered the second my front door swung open without a knock. Bradley, my 38-year-old son-in-law, marched in wearing his expensive tailored suit. My daughter Nadine, who is 35, trailed behind him like a frightened shadow. Bradley did not offer a greeting. He simply tossed a thick, stapled document onto the table. It slid across the wood and stopped right next to my coffee mug. The bold letters at the top read "Residential Lease Agreement." I looked from the paper to Bradley, then to my daughter, waiting for a punchline that never came. Nadine refused to meet my gaze, choosing instead to stare intently at the kitchen sink. Bradley adjusted his designer tie and stood tall. "You have had a free ride for far too long, Tyrone," he began, his voice dripping with arrogance. "The property taxes are going up. The maintenance for the main house is bleeding my accounts dry. Having you live back here for absolutely nothing is a massive financial drain. Nadine and I are trying to build wealth. We cannot afford to subsidize your retirement anymore." I picked up my coffee mug, took a slow sip, and let the silence stretch. Bradley hated silence. It made him nervous. He tapped his shiny leather shoe against the floorboards, crossing his arms over his chest like a corporate boss preparing to fire a worthless employee. "I have calculated the fair market value for a guest house of this size," he continued. "It comes out to $2,000 a month. But Nadine insisted we give you a family discount, so we are bringing it down to $1,555. You will pay on the 1st of every month. If you refuse to sign that contract right now, you have 30 days to pack your bags and find a cheap apartment somewhere else." I looked at Nadine. She was my only child. The girl I had worked 2 long jobs for just to put her through college, skipping my own meals so she could have new dresses for school. "Nadine," I said calmly, "is this what you want?" She flinched. "Dad, things are really tight right now," she mumbled. "Bradley is under a lot of stress. We just need everyone to pull their weight. It is only fair. Only fair. They wanted me to pull my weight by paying rent for a building I had constructed with my own 2 hands. Bradley leaned forward. "Read it and sign it, Tyrone. You are not a guest anymore. You are a tenant." I placed my mug down. I picked up the thick stack of papers. I did not read a single line. Instead, I gripped the top of the contract and tore it straight down the middle. The sound of ripping paper echoed loudly in the small room. Bradley gasped, stepping back in shock as if I had struck him. He had expected me to cower. He had expected the grieving widower to just nod and obey. I tore it again, reducing his legal threat to worthless confetti, and let the pieces flutter down onto the table. "You must have lost your mind," I said, keeping my voice low and dangerous. "You do not dictate terms to me in this house. You do not come through that door without knocking, and you absolutely do not demand rent from the man who gave you the very ground you walk on. And my charity just closed its doors," I said, leaning over the table so he could see the absolute certainty in my eyes. I stood up slowly. Bradley's face turned bright red. "You arrogant old man," he spat out. "This is my property. I built the main house. I am the man of this estate now. I will not be disrespected by a freeloader. You are going to pay me, or I will have the sheriff throw you out on the street." I simply stared him down. "Try it," I challenged him. "Call the sheriff right now. Let us see who ends up on the street." As Bradley fumed, my mind briefly pulled me back 5 years. My beautiful wife Camille was still alive then. Nadine had just married Bradley, and they were drowning in debt. Bradley wanted to live in a wealthy neighborhood, but his credit score was too low to secure a decent mortgage for the kind of luxury mansion he felt he deserved. Camille, with her endless generosity, begged me to help our daughter. We owned 5 acres of prime, fully paid-off land. Against my better judgment, I agreed to a compromise. We allowed Bradley and Nadine to build their custom home on our property. We signed a ground lease. Bradley secured a construction loan to build the physical structure of the main house, but the dirt beneath it, every single blade of grass, belonged entirely to Camille and me. When Camille passed away last year, I moved into the guest house because the main house felt too empty without her. I gave them space. I gave them privacy. I let Bradley play the role of the wealthy homeowner. Over time, that illusion became his reality. He genuinely forgot that he only owned the bricks while I owned the earth. He mistook my quiet grief for weakness. He mistook my silence for surrender. I had spent the last year mourning my wife, staying out of their way, asking for nothing. And this was my reward. An eviction threat from a man who could not even afford the dirt his designer shoes were standing on. Bradley realized his shouting was not working. The intimidation tactics he used on his employees were completely useless against me. His red face twisted into a cruel, calculating smirk. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. "You think you hold the cards here?" he said mockingly. "You think you can just refuse to pay your landlord? Let us see how stubborn you are when you do not have my utilities." He dialed a number, keeping his eyes locked on mine. He spoke 2 words into the receiver. "Cut it." Instantly, the bright lights above my kitchen table flickered and died. The comforting hum of the refrigerator ground to a halt. The electric heater, which had been fighting off the bitter winter cold, powered down with a soft click. The guest house was plunged into sudden freezing silence. Bradley slipped his phone back into his pocket. "The guest house runs on the main estate electrical grid," he whispered, leaning in close. "A grid that I control. You have exactly 24 hours to tape that contract back together and sign it. Otherwise, you can freeze in the dark." He turned on his heel and marched out the door. Nadine lingered for just a second. She looked at me in the dim light. "Dad, just pay the money," she pleaded softly. Then she turned and ran out after her husband, leaving me alone in the cold shadows. The silence left behind by their departure was heavy, but the cold moved in much faster. Without the electric heater humming, the winter air seeped through the window panes, turning the small guest house into an icebox within minutes. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, my breath already forming small white clouds in the dim gray light filtering through the blinds. Most men my age would have panicked. Most would have picked up the phone, called their daughter, and begged for the heat to be turned back on. But I am not most men. I survived working double shifts at the steel mill in the dead of winter for 20 years. A temporary power outage orchestrated by a fragile boy in a designer suit was not going to break my spirit. I walked into the bedroom, my footsteps echoing off the hardwood floor. I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, the one Camille had bought at a flea market decades ago, and pulled out a thick wool sweater and my heavy work boots. I laced them up meticulously. Panic is the enemy of strategy. Bradley thought cutting my power would force me to freeze or submit. He forgot that a man who built his life from scratch always keeps a backup plan. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight from the nightstand, clicked it on, and stepped out the back door into the biting wind, heading straight for the shared garage to reclaim my warmth. The wind howled across the 5 acres of land Camille and I had purchased when it was nothing but dirt and weeds. I crossed the frozen lawn, keeping my flashlight aimed at the frozen ground. The main estate loomed to my right, all its windows blazing with electricity, a glowing monument to Bradley's arrogance. I ignored it. I reached the detached 3-car garage that sat near the edge of the property line. I unlocked the side door and stepped inside. The air in here was stagnant, smelling of motor oil and expensive leather. Bradley kept his pristine black SUV parked in the center bay, dominating the space as if he owned the entire structure. I walked past his ridiculous luxury vehicle and headed to the back corner where I kept my tools and my portable gas generator. I pulled the heavy tarp off the machine. It was fully fueled, maintained perfectly, just waiting for a moment exactly like this one. I needed the heavy-duty extension cords from the storage rack located directly behind Bradley's SUV. As I squeezed past the rear bumper of his car, my hip bumped against the tailgate. To my surprise, the latch clicked. The trunk popped open slightly. Bradley was careless. He always relied on his expensive alarm systems and gated driveways to protect him, forgetting the simplest rule of real security. You always lock your doors. I was about to push the trunk shut when the beam of my flashlight caught something strange. The floorboard of the trunk was slightly ajar, lifted just enough to expose the spare tire compartment underneath. Bradley was not the type of man to fix a flat tire himself. He paid people for that. So why was the hidden compartment open? My instincts, honed by years of protecting my family from the harsh realities of the world, flared up immediately. I set the extension cords down and lifted the heavy trunk floorboard completely. There was no spare tire in the compartment. Instead, tucked neatly into the circular hollow was a thick brown leather portfolio. It looked completely out of place. A man who brags about his wealth and transparency does not hide a locked leather portfolio under the floorboards of his car. I reached down and pulled the portfolio out. It was heavy in my hands. The small brass clasp was not locked. Bradley was arrogant enough to believe no one would ever dare look inside his precious vehicle. I flipped the metal latch and opened the folder, shining my flashlight directly onto the stack of thick papers inside. The very first document was a final notice from a collection agency. The bold red letters warned of an impending lawsuit. I scanned the numbers. Bradley was drowning in massive debt. There were notices for maxed-out credit cards, warnings of seized business assets, and aggressive letters from private lenders demanding immediate payment. He was not a successful businessman. He was a complete fraud living on borrowed credit and suffocating under the weight of his own financial incompetence. My daughter was married to a man whose entire empire was built on sinking sand. Every document I flipped through revealed a deeper layer of his lies. He was shifting funds from account to account, playing a desperate game of financial musical chairs. He was hemorrhaging money faster than he could steal it. No wonder he was suddenly demanding rent from me. He was desperate for cash. I kept turning the pages, digging deeper into his ruin. I flipped to the next page and my breath caught in my throat. It was a lease agreement from a high-end luxury car dealership. The vehicle was a brand new Porsche Cayenne. But it was not the car that made my blood run cold. It was the monthly payment amount printed clearly at the bottom of the page, $1,555. My mind raced, connecting the dots instantly. That was the exact amount Bradley had demanded from me just 20 minutes earlier in my kitchen. $1,555. He did not want rent. He needed me to pay for a luxury vehicle. I looked closer at the name on the lease agreement. It was not Bradley's name. It was not Nadine's name either. The lessee was listed as Crystal Davenport. I stared at the name, the pieces of the puzzle locking together with sickening clarity. Bradley was extorting his father-in-law, threatening to freeze me out of my own home just so he could secretly pay for a sports car for his mistress. The absolute audacity of his plan burned through me like a wildfire. He was literally trying to make me fund his infidelity behind my daughter's back. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket, opened the camera, and quickly snapped clear, bright photographs of every single page. I made sure the name Crystal Davenport and the payment amount were perfectly in focus. This was the ammunition I needed. I was just finishing photographing the Porsche lease agreement when the loud hum of the garage motor shattered the silence. The heavy metal door began to roll upward, casting a harsh square of light from the main driveway into the dark garage. I quickly shoved the papers back into the leather portfolio, tossed it into the spare tire compartment, and slammed the trunk floorboard down. I pushed the trunk closed just as Nadine stepped into the garage, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the freezing wind. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me standing behind Bradley's SUV. Her eyes darted frantically from my heavy winter coat to the flashlight in my hand. "Dad," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of deep guilt and sudden suspicion. "What are you doing out here in the dark? Why are you standing behind Bradley's car?" I turned to face my daughter, sliding my phone safely into my coat pocket. I looked at her pale face, wondering just how much of her husband's deceit she was actively ignoring. "I was getting the generator, Nadine," I replied, my voice steady and cold as the winter air. "Since your husband decided to cut my heat, I am making sure I survive the night. But you tell me, Nadine, what are you doing out here? Are you looking for something specific?" Nadine stared at me, her eyes wide, the freezing wind whipping her expensive silk robe around her legs. For a brief second, she looked like a deer caught in the headlights, terrified I had uncovered whatever dark secrets her husband kept hidden in that garage. But Nadine had always been a quick thinker. The panic in her eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a shimmering pool of well-rehearsed tears. Her shoulders slumped. She let out a pathetic, shaky breath and took a step toward me, burying her face in her hands. "Dad, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking with dramatic perfection. "I did not want it to come to this. I begged Bradley not to approach you so harshly, but we are desperate. You have to understand, Bradley is losing everything." She wiped a perfectly timed tear from her cheek and looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "His company is struggling. The market has been brutal this year and we are bleeding money. If we do not come up with that $1,555 by the first of the month, we are going to lose the business. We might even lose the main house. You have to pay the rent, Dad. You just have to. It is the only way to save our family. I am begging you to step up and help us. Do not let us sink." I stood perfectly still in the dimly lit garage, listening to the echoing sound of my own daughter lying straight to my face. The sheer audacity of her performance churned my stomach. My mind flashed back to the photograph sitting securely in my coat pocket. The lease agreement for a luxury Porsche under the name Crystal Davenport. That was where her precious $1,555 was going. It was not going to save a failing business. It was not going to keep a roof over her head. It was paying for another woman to drive around the city in a high-end sports car. I felt a sickening wave of disgust rise in my throat, threatening to spill over, but I swallowed it down. Rage is a weapon, but only when you keep it concealed. If I confronted her now, if I pulled out my phone and showed her the truth of her husband's infidelity, she would panic. She would run to Bradley and they would scramble to cover their tracks or accelerate whatever fraudulent scheme they were currently planning. I needed them blind. I needed them to believe I was exactly what they thought I was. A helpless, gullible old man easily broken by a few tears. I softened my posture. I let my shoulders drop, mimicking the weight of a father burdened by his child's sudden misfortune. I even managed to inject a tremor of deep concern into my voice. "Nadine, why did you not tell me it was this bad?" I asked, gently taking a step toward her. "I thought Bradley was breaking records at the firm. I thought you two were financially secure." Nadine sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, emboldened by my apparent sympathy. "He is too proud, Dad. You know how Bradley is. He wants to be the provider. He did not want to admit he was failing, so he framed it as rent to save face. But we are drowning in debt. The payroll is backed up and our credit lines are completely maxed out. He is carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for us." I nodded slowly, playing the fool to perfection. "That is terrible," I murmured. "But are you sure he is being honest with you about where the money is going? Has he made any large unnecessary purchases lately? Any new expenses that might be draining the accounts?" Nadine shook her head aggressively, completely oblivious to the trap I had just laid. "No, absolutely not. Bradley has been working late every single night just trying to keep us afloat. He has sacrificed everything for this family. He barely even spends money on himself anymore. We are scraping the bottom of the barrel, Dad. That is why we need your help." The conviction in her voice was almost impressive. She either had no idea her husband was funding a mistress, or she was so deeply entangled in his financial lies that she was willing to say anything to get her hands on my cash. I looked her directly in the eyes and delivered the lie that would secure my advantage. "I had no idea you were in such a dire situation," I said softly. "You should have just told me the truth from the beginning. Let me go back to the guest house. Let me sit down, check my retirement accounts, and see how I can liquidate some funds to help you out." Nadine let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around my neck, hugging me tight. "Oh, thank you, Dad. I knew you would not let us down. I knew you would do the right thing." As she squeezed me, I felt absolutely nothing. No warmth, no fatherly instinct, just the cold, hard realization that the woman hugging me was a parasite. Over her shoulder, my mind drifted back to the past, to the years when Camille was still alive. Camille had always been the soft heart of our household. Whenever Nadine threw a tantrum over a designer dress we could not afford, Camille would secretly pick up extra shifts to buy it for her. When Nadine wrecked her first car because she was texting and driving, Camille smoothed it over, paying the deductible from her own savings so Nadine would not face the consequences. "She is our only girl, Tyrone." Camille used to say, her eyes full of gentle pleading, "We have to give her the world." Camille gave her the world, and in return Nadine learned that the world owed her everything. The entitlement running through my daughter's veins was not Bradley's creation. Bradley had simply weaponized a disease that was already there. Nadine truly believed her tears were a currency that could buy my submission. She viewed me as a safety net, an ATM, not a father. I gently pulled away from her embrace. "Go back inside before you catch a cold," I told her. "I will handle things on my end." Nadine gave me one last tearful smile, turned around, and hurried back across the frozen lawn toward the glowing warmth of the main estate. I picked up my extension cords and the heavy portable generator. I stepped out of the side door of the garage, but instead of walking back to the guest house, I stopped. I stood quietly in the dark shadows just outside the garage wall, listening as Nadine reached the back patio of the main house. Through the crisp, silent winter air, her voice carried perfectly. The crying had stopped entirely. Her tone was no longer shaky or desperate. It was sharp, victorious, and cold. "Bradley, it is done," she said loudly into her cell phone. The old man bought the whole routine. He felt so bad for us, he is probably going to transfer the funds by tomorrow morning. You can go ahead and call the appraiser. Let us get this land valued so we can move forward with the plan." The back door slammed shut, cutting off the rest of her words. I stood in the freezing dark, the heavy generator pulling at my arms. My heart had turned to stone. The war had officially begun. The low, steady rumble of my portable gas generator had kept the guest house tolerably warm through the bitter, freezing night. I sat near the window the next morning, sipping a fresh cup of coffee brewed on my camping stove, watching the thick frost slowly melt off the glass. That was when I saw him. A man in a beige trench coat and wire-rimmed glasses was pacing the perimeter of my guest house. He held a laser measuring tool in one hand and a thick electronic clipboard in the other. He stopped every few feet to jot down numbers, his eyes scanning the architectural details of the roofline and the foundation. I watched him pull out a professional digital camera and snap a photograph of my front porch. He was not a repairman. He was a commercial property appraiser. Nadine had not been bluffing on the phone the night before. They were moving at lightning speed to get a formal valuation on the 5 acres. I put my coffee mug down on the kitchen counter. The sheer disrespect of sending a stranger to measure the walls of my home while I was sitting inside of it told me everything I needed to know about Bradley and his level of absolute desperation. I zipped up my heavy winter jacket and stepped out the front door, the cold air hitting my face instantly. I walked right up to the man, planting myself firmly between him and the exterior wall of my home. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level but loud enough to demand immediate attention. "Can I ask exactly what you are doing measuring the exterior of my private residence?" The man lowered his camera and offered a polite, highly practiced smile. "Good morning, sir," he said professionally. "I am conducting a comprehensive land and structural valuation for the estate owner. I am just finishing up the square footage estimates for this auxiliary dwelling unit." Auxiliary dwelling unit. The sterile corporate phrase made my jaw clench. This was the home I had moved into to preserve my sanity after my beloved wife passed, and they were treating it like a glorified storage shed. "I am the estate owner," I informed him coldly, "and I did not authorize any valuation of this property. You are trespassing." The appraiser blinked in confusion, looking down at his clipboard. "That cannot be right," he murmured. "The gentleman who hired my firm explicitly stated he held full legal authority over the entire 5 acres. Right on cue, the heavy oak front door of the main house swung open. Bradley marched out onto the frozen lawn, practically vibrating with unearned confidence. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, his hands stuffed casually into his pockets. He did not look like a man drowning in debt or hiding a mistress. He looked like a king surveying his conquered territory. "Good morning," Tyrone Bradley called out, his voice loud and aggressively patronizing. "I see you met Mr. Higgins. I hired his firm to get an accurate market value on the estate. We are looking into some high-yield financial restructuring, and the bank requires a fresh appraisal of all the assets, including your little guest house." I turned my attention fully to Bradley. "Financial restructuring," I repeated dryly. "Is that the new corporate term for stealing land to pay off your luxury car leases?" Bradley narrowed his eyes, clearly missing my subtle reference to his hidden Porsche, but catching the hostility in my tone. "Watch your mouth, old man," he snapped, stepping closer. "You do not own anything here anymore. You are a tenant who has not paid his rent. I am the one managing this estate, and I am the one making the financial decisions." I crossed my arms over my chest. "You cannot manage land you do not own, Bradley. The master deed for this entire 5-acre plot is in my name. You own the bricks of that mansion, but I own the dirt you are standing on. You cannot legally appraise or leverage my property without my explicit written consent." Bradley barked out a harsh, mocking laugh. He reached inside his overcoat and pulled out a folded legal document. He held it up between 2 fingers like a winning lottery ticket. "You mean this consent?" he sneered. He took a step forward and aggressively shoved the paper into my chest. I caught it before it hit the frozen ground. "Mr. Higgins here already has a copy on file," Bradley continued, his voice dripping with venom. "It is a comprehensive, legally binding power of attorney. It grants me total administrative and financial control over your assets. The document clearly states that due to your declining cognitive health, I am authorized to act as your primary legal proxy. I can sell, mortgage, or leverage this land however I see fit." I unfolded the heavy paper. The legal jargon was dense, but my eyes went straight to the bottom of the second page. There, sitting right above a shiny notary seal, was my signature, Tyrone Jenkins. I stared at the dark blue ink. It was a very good forgery. The loops and angles were incredibly close to my actual handwriting. Someone had clearly practiced this signature for hours to get the flow right. But it was definitely not my signature. I had never signed this document. I had never stood before that notary. Bradley had crossed a massive line. He had gone from being an entitled, cheating son-in-law to a literal federal criminal. He had forged a binding legal document to steal my entire estate. The sheer scale of his arrogance was staggering. If I tore the paper up right now and screamed about forgery, Bradley would panic. He might destroy the original copy or aggressively cover his tracks before I could get a lawyer involved. I needed him to feel invincible. I needed him to believe he had completely outsmarted me. I let my hands tremble just slightly. I widened my eyes and let my posture slump, giving him the exact image of a defeated, confused old man. "I do not remember signing this," I whispered, making my voice sound weak and terribly uncertain. Bradley snatched the paper back from my hands with a triumphant smirk. "Of course you do not remember, Tyrone. Your memory has been slipping for months. That is exactly why Nadine and I had to take over. We are just protecting the family assets. Go back inside and stay out of Mr. Higgins' way." I turned without another word and walked slowly back to the guest house, leaving them to their measurements. The second my front door clicked shut, my fragile old man act vanished completely. I pulled out my phone and immediately dialed Mr. Kaplan, the fierce, no-nonsense attorney who had handled my family trust for the past 20 years. He answered on the second ring. "Tyrone, my friend, what can I do for you?" I paced the floor of my freezing kitchen. "Kaplan, I need you to pull up the public records on my estate right now." Bradley just flashed a forged power of attorney in my face. He is having the land appraised, and I guarantee you he is preparing to leverage my property to secure a massive loan. Mr. Kaplan went completely silent on the other end of the line. "Forgery of a power of attorney is a major felony, Tyrone. I will run a title search immediately and see what he has filed with the county clerk. Do not confront him again. Let me build the trap." I agreed and hung up the phone. I spent the rest of the day in quiet preparation, but Bradley was not finished trying to break my spirit. Long after the sun went down, a violent crash shattered the silence of the night. A heavy rock smashed directly through my living room window, spraying jagged glass across the hardwood floor. Tied tightly around the rock with a piece of twine was a crumpled note. I picked it up and smoothed it out under the beam of my flashlight. The message was scrawled in thick black marker: "Pay the rent or leave. Stop making this difficult, old man." I stared at the crude black letters scrawled across the paper. The intimidation tactic was pathetic. A younger man might have marched over to the main house, kicked down the front door, and thrown punches. A weaker man might have packed his bags and fled into the night. I did neither. I simply dropped the rock and the threatening note onto the kitchen counter and walked over to the utility closet to grab my heavy-duty push broom. The freezing winter wind was now howling directly through the shattered window pane, bringing a flurry of snowflakes onto my hardwood floor. I methodically swept up every jagged shard of glass, my movements calm and deliberate. I was not afraid of a coward who threw rocks in the dark. I found a thick piece of industrial cardboard in the garage and taped it securely over the broken frame, sealing out the bitter cold. Bradley was escalating his tactics because he was backed into a corner. He needed me gone so he could leverage the land without my interference. The physical destruction of my property was not a display of power. It was a glaring sign of his absolute desperation. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee from a thermos, sat back down at my table, and waited for the sun to rise. I had a meeting to get to, and I was going to make sure Bradley paid for every single shard of glass he had just scattered across my floor. First thing, the next morning, I drove my trusty pickup truck downtown to the law offices of Kaplan and Associates. The building was old, distinguished, and built to last, much like the lawyer himself. Mr. Kaplan was a sharp-eyed man in his late 60s who had guided my family through decades of complicated legal matters. He was waiting for me in his corner office, a thick stack of manila folders already spread out across his polished mahogany desk. I took a seat in the heavy leather chair opposite him and placed the rock and the threatening note directly onto the center of his desk. "Bradley threw this through my living room window last night," I said, evenly keeping my emotions completely in check. "He is trying to terrorize me into leaving the estate so he can sell the land out from under me." Mr. Kaplan did not even blink at the display of violence. He calmly adjusted his glasses, picked up the note with careful fingers, and placed it securely inside a clear plastic evidence sleeve. "He is making incredibly foolish mistakes. Tyrone Kaplan said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that always commanded respect. "I ran the title search you asked for yesterday afternoon." Bradley did indeed file a power of attorney with the county clerk 3 weeks ago. I pulled the physical document. The signature is a highly sophisticated forgery, but it was notarized by a man whose license was revoked last year for fraudulent practices. Bradley has officially committed a string of major felonies. I nodded slowly, feeling the cold satisfaction of having my worst suspicions validated by a legal professional. "What is our immediate counterattack?" I asked. Kaplan opened the thickest folder on his desk. He pulled out a yellowed, slightly faded document with my signature and Camille's signature at the very bottom. "We hit him with the exact weapon he forgot you hold," Kaplan said, tapping the paper. "The original ground lease." He slid the document across the desk so I could read it. I remembered signing this 5 years ago like it was yesterday. Camille had been sitting right next to me, holding my hand, pleading with me to give our daughter a significant head start in life. We had legally leased the 5 acres of land to Bradley and Nadine for 99 years at a rate of $1 per month. "Let me refresh your memory on how commercial ground leases actually operate," Kaplan explained, tracing the clauses with his expensive fountain pen. Bradley took out a massive construction loan to build that luxury mansion. Because he paid to build it, he legally owns the physical structure. He owns the expensive bricks, the imported plumbing, the slate roof, and the drywall. But you own the dirt. You own every single inch of the earth sitting directly beneath his foundation. He cannot sell the house without selling the land, and he cannot sell the land because his name is nowhere on the master deed. I leaned back in my chair, fully absorbing the sheer, undeniable leverage I possessed. Bradley thought he was the undisputed lord of the manor just because his house was bigger than mine. He had completely forgotten that a house is absolutely worthless if you do not control the ground holding it up. "Exactly," Kaplan continued with a fierce grin. "And because his forged power of attorney is legally invalid, any attempt he makes to appraise or leverage the dirt beneath his house is textbook mortgage fraud. He has trapped himself in a financial prison of his own making, and he does not even realize the doors have been locked." "But the situation gets even worse for your son-in-law," Kaplan said, flipping to the 3rd page of the ground lease. "Camille was a deeply kind woman, Tyrone, but you were always a pragmatic man who understood the need for safeguards. Do you remember the specific termination clause I strongly insisted we include in this contract before you ever agreed to let them build?" I leaned forward and looked at the highlighted paragraph on the page. The exact legal phrasing came rushing back to me. Section 7. I read aloud, my voice steady. "Any documented act of fraud, criminal activity, or malicious damage to the landowner's primary property by the lessee constitutes an immediate and non-negotiable breach of this agreement." Kaplan nodded sharply, tapping the evidence bag holding the rock and the threatening note. "Precisely. By forging your signature on a legal document and intentionally shattering your living room window, Bradley has actively triggered the termination clause. The ground lease is now completely voidable at your absolute discretion. If we cancel this lease, Bradley loses all legal right to keep his house on your dirt. The property law in this state dictates that any permanent structure affixed to the property automatically reverts entirely to the landowner. He will not just lose his access to the estate. He will lose the entire physical mansion he built. Every single brick becomes yours." I sat in stunned silence, realizing I held the absolute power to strip Bradley of everything he claimed to own. But Kaplan was not finished. His face grew exceptionally grim as he pulled a final red flag document from the very bottom of his stack. "There is a massive ticking clock on this entire situation," Tyrone Kaplan warned, sliding the heavy paper toward me. I did a deep dive into Bradley's recent banking activity. 3 weeks ago, the exact same day he filed that forged power of attorney, he used it to secretly take out a second mortgage on the main house for $200,000. He told the bank he had your full authorization to leverage the underlying land. I stared at the staggering loan amount in sheer disbelief. He stole $200,000 against my estate to pay off his failing business and his mistress's luxury sports car. "And he has already defaulted," Kaplan said bluntly. "He took the cash, blew through it immediately to cover his other mounting debts, and missed the very first payment. The bank is not messing around. They have initiated aggressive collection protocols. If we do not act fast to formally void the lease and prove the fraud to the authorities, the bank is going to foreclose on the entire 5-acre estate, including your guest house, in less than 30 days. I drove my truck back to the estate with a heavy but focused mind. The 30-day deadline hung over my head like a ticking bomb, but I refused to let panic dictate my actions. As I pulled through the wrought iron gates and parked near my guest house, I noticed Bradley's black SUV already idling in the circular driveway of the main mansion. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a Wednesday. Nadine was at her corporate job downtown where she worked 50 hours a week to maintain the illusion of their perfect marriage. Bradley stepped out of the driver's side wearing a casual cashmere sweater, looking entirely too relaxed for a man on the brink of federal indictment. He walked around to the passenger door and opened it with a flourish. A woman stepped out. She was definitely not my daughter. She wore knee-high suede boots, a pristine white designer coat, and oversized sunglasses that screamed expensive entitlement. She looped her arm through Bradley's, leaning her head against his shoulder in a display of practiced intimacy. This had to be Crystal Davenport. The audacity of bringing his mistress onto my property into the home my daughter lived in the middle of broad daylight was staggering. Bradley operated with the reckless impunity of a man who believed there were zero consequences for his actions. I stayed completely still on my porch, blending into the shadows of the wooden beams, and watched them approach. I smoothly pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket, activated the video recording feature, and held it casually at my side, making sure the lens had a clear, unobstructed view of the driveway. I needed concrete evidence of this affair, not just paper trails of Porsche payments. As they strolled up the brick walkway toward the grand double doors of the mansion, Crystal paused. She lowered her sunglasses, her heavily manicured eyebrows pulling together in a sharp frown as she caught sight of me standing quietly on my porch in my worn work boots and heavy winter coat. She nudged Bradley in the ribs, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. "Bradley, I thought you said we had absolute privacy today," she complained, her voice carrying a sharp nasal whine that pierced the crisp winter air. "Why is the hired help just standing around staring at us?" I did not flinch. I did not correct her. I kept my face entirely blank, recording every single syllable. A lesser man would have marched over there, demanded respect, and thrown them both off the property. But true power requires absolute discipline. I needed them to hang themselves with their own words. Bradley glanced over his shoulder, his eyes meeting mine. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine panic crossed his face. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew the extreme risk of me catching him. But true to his cowardly nature, he quickly masked his fear with a dismissive sneer. He did not defend me. He did not introduce me as his father-in-law or the legal owner of the very estate he was standing on. Instead, he leaned in and whispered to her, speaking loudly enough for my microphone to catch the insult. "Do not worry about him, babe. He is just the old groundskeeper. He is practically deaf and half blind. He will be gone by the end of the month anyway." Crystal let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She adjusted her designer coat and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She looked at me the way one looks at mud scraped off a boot. "Well, tell him to go rake leaves or something," she scoffed loudly. "I do not want the hired help creeping around while we are trying to celebrate. It ruins the aesthetic of the property. This place is going to need a massive landscaping overhaul once we finally take over. The current vibe is incredibly depressing." I remained perfectly still, a silent statue, absorbing their disrespect. Bradley smirked, wrapping his arm tighter around her waist, completely emboldened by my lack of reaction. "Come on, Crystal, let us go inside. I have the champagne chilling in the master suite." He unlocked the front door of the mansion, leading his mistress into the home built on my dirt, funded by my daughter's hard work and my wife's generosity. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, leaving me alone in the cold. I stopped the recording and securely saved the video file to 2 separate cloud drives. Crystal had just handed me the final devastating piece of the puzzle on a silver platter. Her words were not just a superficial insult, they were a blatant, documented confession. She spoke about taking over the property with absolute certainty. They were actively conspiring to seize my family's legacy. I walked back inside the guest house, my mind operating with the cold precision of a military tactician. The entire scope of Bradley's endgame was now laid bare before me. He never intended to save his failing business, and he certainly never intended to stay married to Nadine. His financial empire was already dead. He was simply looting the corpse before he abandoned ship. He forged my signature on the power of attorney to illegally secure that $200,000 mortgage from the bank. He used that cash to string along his creditors and placate his high-maintenance mistress with a luxury sports car. But $200,000 was not enough to sustain their lifestyle forever. That was why he needed me evicted immediately. He planned to leverage the entire 5-acre estate, drain every last drop of equity from the land, and vanish. He was going to sell the ground right out from under my daughter take the massive payout, and run off with Crystal Davenport, leaving Nadine completely homeless and drowning in the fraudulent debt he had tied to their marital accounts. He was setting my daughter up to take the fall for his federal crimes, ensuring she would be legally ruined while he started a new wealthy life. The sheer malice of his strategy proved he possessed zero humanity. He viewed my family as nothing more than a temporary bank account to be drained and discarded. I needed to know exactly how much time I had before Bradley executed his final move. I walked to the edge of my porch, staying out of sight of the mansion windows. Because Bradley was arrogant, he had left the large bay window of the master bedroom cracked open to let in the winter breeze. Sound travels remarkably well over open land. I could hear Crystal's sharp voice cutting through the air, completely shattering their romantic facade. "I am tired of waiting, Bradley," she snapped, her tone entirely devoid of the affection she had displayed in the driveway. "The creditors are calling my phone now because my name is on that car lease. You promised me this estate would be liquidated by the 15th. It is either me or your miserable wife and that stubborn old man. You have exactly 3 days to kick him off this property and finalize the sale, or I am walking away and sending all the financial records straight to your sweet, clueless Nadine." Bradley's voice responded, frantic and pleading. "I am handling it, Crystal. The eviction is already in motion. The old man will be gone by Friday, I swear. Just give me 72 hours to force him out." I stepped back into the shadows of my guest house, my blood turning to ice. Friday. I had less than 72 hours before Bradley launched a total assault on my home. What will happen next? Friday morning arrived with the heavy crunch of gravel and the low hum of expensive engines. I stood by my kitchen window with a steaming cup of coffee and watched a fleet of luxury catering vans roll straight through my front gates. A team of workers was rapidly assembling massive white event tents across the frozen lawn of my estate. Heat lamps were being ignited. Trays of crystal champagne flutes caught the winter sun. Bradley was hosting a massive outdoor fundraiser, likely a desperate final attempt to secure fresh capital from private investors before his entire fraudulent empire collapsed. He needed a show of immense wealth to convince these executives he was a safe bet. But a high-stakes investor party meant he needed absolute control over the narrative. He could not risk his supposed groundskeeper wandering around and ruining the aesthetic. I finished my coffee, washed the mug, and walked over to my front door to retrieve the morning newspaper from the porch. I turned the brass knob and pushed. The door refused to budge. I frowned, pulling harder. The wood strained, but a heavy metallic clanking sound echoed from the other side. I looked through the side window. A thick industrial steel padlock had been bolted directly into the exterior doorframe overnight. Bradley had literally locked me inside my own guest house. He had treated me like an animal to be caged. He honestly believed a $30 piece of hardware from a home improvement store was going to keep me contained. Bradley had spent his entire life paying other men to fix his problems. He had no concept of what a man who actually built his own life was capable of doing. I spent 30 years working in the steel mills, maintaining massive industrial machinery and fixing every broken pipe, engine, and lock in my own home. I did not panic. I simply walked into my utility room, opened my red metal toolbox, and pulled out a standard tension wrench and a standard steel rake pick. I stepped back to the front door, slid the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, and applied a light, steady pressure. I inserted the rake pick above it, scrubbing the internal pins with a smooth, rhythmic motion. In less than 40 seconds, the cylinder clicked. The heavy steel padlock popped open and fell onto the porch with a dull thud. I pushed the door open, feeling the crisp winter air rush into the house. But I did not walk out onto the lawn. Not yet. If I was going to crash a high society fundraiser full of wealthy investors, I was not going to do it wearing a faded flannel shirt and heavy work boots. I was not going to give Bradley the satisfaction of looking like the impoverished old man he claimed I was. I walked into my bedroom and opened the very back of my closet. I reached past my everyday clothes and pulled out the protective garment bag holding my finest attire. It was a bespoke charcoal gray 3-piece suit that Camille had custom tailored for me in Chicago for our 30th wedding anniversary. The wool was flawless. The cut was timeless. I took my time getting dressed. I fastened a crisp white collared shirt. I tied a deep burgundy silk tie. I polished my black leather Oxford shoes until they shined like glass. Finally, I strapped my heavy gold watch to my left wrist. It was a retirement gift from the mill, a symbol of 30 years of honest, grueling labor. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. The reflection looking back at me was not a confused, helpless victim. It was a man of immense dignity, sharp intellect, and absolute authority. I looked exactly like the millionaire owner of a 5-acre estate. I slipped my smartphone securely into my inner breast pocket, making sure the camera was accessible. I stepped out onto the porch, leaving the broken padlock discarded on the floorboards. I walked smoothly down the steps and strolled directly across the lawn toward the massive white event tents. I blended seamlessly into the crowd of executives and socialites. Waiters carrying silver trays of caviar and champagne drifted past me, nodding respectfully, assuming I was one of the esteemed guests. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and positioned myself near a tall heat lamp standing perfectly still, becoming a silent observer in the middle of Bradley's desperate circus. The jazz quartet playing in the corner provided a smooth background noise. I watched the wealthy men in their designer suits and the women in their fur coats. They were all completely oblivious to the fact that they were standing on a financial landmine. I scanned the crowd until I found my target. Bradley was standing near the center of the largest tent, completely surrounded by a tight circle of older wealthy men. Bradley was holding court with the aggressive confidence of a seasoned con artist. He had a glass of expensive scotch in one hand, gesturing broadly across the estate with the other. I stepped closer, keeping my back angled toward a floral arrangement so he would not immediately spot me, and listened to the absolute garbage spilling from his mouth. "I bought this entire 5-acre parcel completely raw," Bradley boasted loudly to the group of captivated investors. "I saw the vision when no one else did. I designed the main house from the ground up, but the real value is the land itself. I have exclusive zoning rights to bulldoze the auxiliary structures in the back and develop a luxury commercial subdivision." One of the older investors, a man with a thick silver beard, nodded in approval. "That is an aggressive play, Bradley. Securing the land rights in this zip code must have cost you a fortune." Bradley chuckled, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "It was a massive capital investment." He lied smoothly. "But when you own the dirt, you control the future. I hold the master deed completely free and clear. That is exactly why my firm is offering such high yield returns. We are sitting on an absolute goldmine, gentlemen." He smiled warmly at the men playing the role of the self-made titan to perfection. Every single word was a calculated fabrication to steal their investment money and fund his escape with Crystal. I had heard enough. It was time to shatter the illusion. I stepped out from behind the floral arrangement and walked directly into the center of the circle of investors. The men naturally parted, making way for my tailored suit and commanding presence. Bradley was mid-sentence when he finally made eye contact with me, his jaw practically unhinged. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a cashmere suit. "Excuse me, gentlemen," I said, my voice rich, loud, and carrying perfectly over the jazz music. I turned my gaze directly to Bradley, locking onto his panicked eyes. "Bradley, I apologize for interrupting your business pitch, but we have a pressing administrative matter to handle. Your land rent for the dirt sitting directly beneath your house is now 3 days past due. I need that $1,555 by the end of business today, or I will be forced to cancel your ground lease and claim your physical house as my own." The investors fell completely silent. They stared at Bradley in profound confusion. The public humiliation was absolute. Bradley stared at me, his eyes bulging with sheer uncontrollable rage. The calm corporate facade evaporated instantly. He dropped his expensive glass of scotch onto the frozen grass, letting out a primal, furious scream. He lunged forward, charging straight at me with both fists raised. Bradley crashed into me with the full, reckless force of a desperate man. His hands slammed against the lapels of my tailored suit, his fingers twisting into the wool fabric. I am a strong man, capable of easily sidestepping a frantic charge or putting him flat on his back, but I made a conscious tactical decision to let gravity do the work. I allowed my feet to slide backward on the frozen grass. I fell, letting the momentum carry me down. My back hit the cold, hard earth with a heavy thud, the breath rushing out of my lungs. Bradley stood over me, his chest heaving, his face contorted in absolute fury. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, screaming at the top of his lungs, "You shut your mouth. You have no idea what you are talking about." The elegant jazz music abruptly stopped, the musicians lowering their instruments in shock. The circle of wealthy investors recoiled, pulling their expensive coats tighter around themselves. Men of capital do not appreciate public displays of violence. They prefer their ruthlessness confined to boardrooms and spreadsheets. The air in the tent grew suffocatingly tense. A waiter dropped a silver tray of champagne glasses, the crystal shattering against the brick walkway, mirroring the total destruction of Bradley's carefully crafted illusion. I remained perfectly still on the frozen ground, brushing a stray piece of frost from the sleeve of my suit. I did not raise a hand to defend myself. I did not shout for help or threaten legal action. I simply turned my head slightly to the left, looking past Bradley's polished shoes, past the horrified faces of his potential investors, and stared directly into the dark circular lens of the high-definition security camera I had securely mounted under the eaves of the main house roofline 3 days prior. The small red recording light blinked steadily, an unblinking electronic witness capturing every second of the unprovoked assault. Bradley had just handed me a felony battery charge on a silver platter. The heavy oak doors of the mansion suddenly flew open. Nadine rushed out onto the lawn, her high heels sinking into the frozen grass. She had likely been inside schmoozing the wives of the executives, completely unaware that her husband's financial house of cards was collapsing in the front yard. She saw me lying on the ground. She saw Bradley standing over me with clenched fists. For a brief, agonizing moment, I waited to see if the daughter I raised would rush to my side, if she would reprimand her husband for physically attacking her elderly father. Instead, she rushed to Bradley, placing her manicured hands on his chest to push him back, her eyes darting frantically toward the wealthy investors. "Oh my goodness," Nadine gasped, her voice pitched unnaturally high to ensure everyone heard her. "I am so sorry, gentlemen. Please excuse this disruption. My father is severely ill. He suffers from advanced dementia. He frequently wanders out of his care facility and experiences violent delusions about owning property and collecting money. We have been trying to manage his episodes privately, but his condition is rapidly deteriorating. I lay on the cold ground listening to my own daughter effortlessly assassinate my character. She did not stumble over the lie. She delivered it with the polished ease of a practiced sociopath, smoothly painting me as a lunatic to protect her husband's fragile ego and their fading chance at securing investment capital. Bradley instantly seized the lifeline she threw him. He smoothed his suit jacket, transforming his furious scowl into an expression of weary, burdened compassion. "It is an absolute tragedy," Bradley sighed, shaking his head. "We have been spending a fortune on his medical care, but he refuses to take his medication. He gets confused and lashes out. I deeply apologize. You all had to witness this private family struggle." The investors exchanged deeply uncomfortable glances. Wealthy men despise emotional baggage and unpredictable liabilities. One by one, they began to step away, murmuring polite but firm excuses about prior engagements and tight schedules. The potential capital Bradley so desperately needed was literally walking out the front gates. Nadine knelt down next to me, her face pale, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "You are ruining everything. Go back to your hole before I have the police drag you away for trespassing." I looked into her eyes. There was no warmth left, no trace of the little girl I had carried on my shoulders. I slowly pushed myself up off the frozen earth, brushing the dirt from my tailored trousers. I did not say a word to either of them. I simply adjusted my tie, gave the fleeing investors a polite, dignified nod, and walked calmly back toward the guest house, leaving Bradley and Nadine standing alone in the center of their ruined party. Once safely inside the guest house, I locked the door and pulled out my laptop. I accessed the secure server connected to my exterior cameras and immediately downloaded the high-definition footage of the entire altercation. The video and audio were crystal clear. It showed my calm demeanor, Bradley's aggressive physical assault, and Nadine's calculated, malicious lie about my mental health. I uploaded the files to 3 separate encrypted cloud drives and emailed a secure link directly to Mr. Kaplan with the subject line "Felony Assault and Defamation." My physical body ached slightly from the hard fall onto the frozen ground, but my mind was sharper than ever. Nadine had crossed the ultimate line. By actively participating in the cover-up and publicly labeling me as mentally incompetent to protect her husband's financial scam, she was no longer just a passive bystander. She was a fully willing co-conspirator. Any lingering trace of fatherly hesitation I harbored was completely erased by her actions today. She had chosen her side. She had prioritized a fraudulent lifestyle over her own flesh and blood. I poured myself a glass of cold water, took a long sip, and began drafting a meticulous time-stamped timeline of every event that had transpired since the initial rent demand. I was building an impenetrable fortress of evidence brick by brick. The next morning, the sky was a dull, heavy gray, promising more snow. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing the financial disclosures Mr. Kaplan had sent over when 3 sharp, authoritative knocks hammered against my front door. I checked the live feed on my phone. Standing on my porch was a tall man in a tailored charcoal suit clutching a thick leather briefcase. He did not look like a delivery driver or a repairman. He had the rigid, impatient posture of a man accustomed to giving orders. I opened the door. The man did not smile. "Mr. Tyrone Jenkins," he stated, his tone devoid of any warmth, "I am Dr. Eris Thorne. I have been retained by your family to conduct a mandatory cognitive health assessment." He reached into his briefcase and produced a stack of official-looking papers bearing the seal of a local psychiatric facility. "Your daughter and son-in-law have filed an emergency petition detailing your severe behavioral decline, including instances of unprovoked public aggression and severe delusions regarding property ownership." He thrust the papers toward me. "I have an involuntary psychiatric hold order signed by a judge pending the results of this immediate evaluation. If you refuse to cooperate with me right now, I am legally authorized to contact law enforcement and have you forcibly removed from these premises for your own safety." I stepped back and gestured for Dr. Thorne to enter my home. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. A man waving a psychiatric hold order is expecting resistance, shouting, and confusion. I gave him absolute chilling calm. Thorne stepped into the living room, his eyes scanning the space with aggressive judgment. He did not ask for permission before sitting in my armchair, clicking his pen and opening his notepad. "Mr. Jenkins, let us start with basic orientation." Thorne began, his tone slow and patronizing, the exact kind of voice reserved for unruly toddlers. "Can you tell me what year it is and exactly who owns the property we are sitting on right now?" It was a blatant trap. If I said I owned it, he would write down that I was suffering from delusions exactly as Nadine had claimed at the party. If I said Bradley owned it, I would be legally conceding my own land on a recorded medical document. "I hear you have been experiencing significant memory lapses." Thorne continued smoothly, not waiting for my answer. "Your daughter mentioned you often wander around outside, forgetting where you are and becoming hostile when gently corrected. Has that been happening frequently?" He leaned forward, adopting a faux sympathetic expression. "It is okay to admit you are confused, Tyrone. We are just here to get you into a safe managed facility where you cannot hurt yourself or your family anymore." I remained standing, towering over him as he sat in my armchair. I did not defend my memory. I did not scramble to prove my sanity. I simply stared at him until the fake sympathy melted off his face, replaced by a flicker of genuine unease. "To answer your first question," I said, my voice crisp and commanding, "the year is exactly what it says on the top of the fraudulent documents you are holding. As for who owns this property, the master deed is recorded with the county clerk under the name Tyrone Jenkins. That is a verifiable legal fact, not a medical delusion." I watched his pen hover over the paper. He was unsure how to document a completely lucid, fact-based response. "You are very quick to diagnose me based on the desperate lies of a man drowning in debt." I continued, taking a steady step closer to him. "But let us talk about your diagnostic credentials, Dr. Thorne. Or should I say, Mr. Thorne." The color instantly drained from his cheeks. His hand twitched, the pen scratching a harsh black line across his notepad. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the dossier Mr. Kaplan had emailed me the previous night. My lawyer is an exceptionally thorough man. When I told him Bradley was threatening me with medical intervention, Kaplan immediately ran a background check on every psychiatric professional associated with Bradley's country club circle. "You lost your medical license 2 years ago," I stated bluntly, reading directly from the illuminated screen. "The state medical board suspended your credentials indefinitely for accepting kickbacks from private care facilities. You signed off on involuntary commitments for wealthy clients who wanted to lock away inconvenient elderly relatives just to access their trust funds." Thorne swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He tried to puff up his chest and maintain his shattered authority. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. I am a licensed professional consulting on a highly volatile situation. You are a disgraced fraud looking for a quick payday." I shot back, my voice echoing loudly in the small room. "You are not licensed to prescribe aspirin, let alone sign a psychiatric hold. You forged that judge's signature, or you used an old invalid template from before your suspension. If you had a real court order, you would have arrived with law enforcement, not a cheap leather briefcase and a bad attitude." I stepped right up to the edge of his chair, casting a long shadow over his trembling form. "You walked into my home to help a desperate man steal my estate. That makes you an active participant in a criminal conspiracy to commit wire fraud and elder abuse. I already have your face and your admission recorded on my internal security system. My lawyer is currently drafting a formal complaint to the state attorney general. The penalty for practicing medicine without a license is severe. The penalty for using that fake authority to facilitate real estate fraud carries a mandatory federal prison sentence. You chose the wrong family to scam today." I watched the realization wash over him. He realized I was not a confused target. I was a man who had completely outmaneuvered his entire operation before he even knocked on my door. "You are looking at a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary," I added softly, "unless you walk out of that door right now and never return." Thorne did not try to argue. He did not try to defend his medical opinion or threaten me with the police. The arrogant swagger he carried into my home vanished entirely, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man who realized he had just walked into a legal bear trap. He practically scrambled out of my armchair, his hands shaking so violently he fumbled with the brass latch on his briefcase. He shoved his notepad inside, completely abandoning his professional facade. "I am leaving." Thorne stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. "I was severely misled about this situation. Bradley told me you were completely incapacitated and unable to communicate. I want absolutely no part of this legal mess. Keep my name out of it." He practically sprinted to the front door, his expensive shoes sliding dangerously on the hardwood floor. "Do not bother running to Bradley for your payment," I called out after him as he grabbed the door handle. "He does not have any money to pay you anyway. He is bankrupt." Thorne tore the front door open and fled across the frozen lawn. He did not even look toward the main house to brief his employer. He jumped into his sedan, slammed the door shut, and sped out of the estate gate so fast his tires spun on the icy driveway. I closed my front door and locked it quietly. The medical threat was completely neutralized. I watched from my living room window as Bradley marched out of the main house, his face twisted in absolute fury. He had clearly watched his hired gun flee the property in a blind panic. The realization that his medical extortion plan had failed spectacularly broke whatever tiny shred of self-control he had left. He stomped across the lawn, but he did not come to my door to confront me. Instead, he veered toward the secondary storage shed near the garage where I kept the sealed boxes of Camille's personal belongings. Those were her cherished books, her vintage dresses, the carefully preserved photo albums of our life together. Bradley kicked the wooden door of the shed open with brutal force. He began grabbing the heavy cardboard boxes and violently hurling them out onto the frozen, mud-stained grass. The boxes split open on impact. Camille's delicate porcelain tea set shattered against the frozen dirt. Her favorite silk scarves spilled out, catching the bitter winter wind. He was destroying my late wife's legacy, stomping on her memories in a pathetic, savage attempt to inflict maximum emotional pain because he could not defeat me intellectually or legally. It was the ultimate desecration of the woman who had given him the land he built his life upon. I felt my chest tighten, a cold, deadly rage settling deep into my bones. The sky above the estate, already a heavy and bruised gray, suddenly broke open. A freezing, relentless rain began to pour, washing away the last remnants of frost and turning the torn earth into a slick, muddy swamp. I did not grab an umbrella. I did not put my heavy winter coat back on. I simply unlocked my front door and stepped out into the freezing deluge. I walked slowly toward the ransacked storage shed, the icy water soaking instantly through my tailored suit shirt, chilling me to the bone. Bradley had retreated to the dry warmth of the main mansion, leaving the wreckage of my wife's life scattered across the lawn like garbage. I knelt in the freezing mud. The sharp edges of Camille's shattered porcelain tea set dug into my bare hands, mixing tiny drops of my blood with the freezing rain. I gently picked up her favorite silk scarves, now ruined and plastered with dark, heavy mud. I found the leather-bound photo album containing pictures from our 30th anniversary. Its pages soaked and tearing in the bitter wind. I did not scream. I did not look up at the mansion windows to curse the coward hiding behind them. I stayed on my knees in the freezing rain, meticulously gathering every single broken piece, every soaked photograph, and every torn fabric. I cradled her ruined memories against my chest, shielding them from the storm, with my own body exactly as I had shielded her during her final days. I carried the heavy soaked boxes back inside the guest house, kicking the front door shut behind me with a wet thud. I laid the ruined items out carefully across my wooden kitchen table, the muddy water dripping steadily onto the floorboards, forming dark puddles at my feet. I stood there shivering and dripping wet and stared at the destruction. The pain in my chest was not the sharp, frantic panic of a victim. It was a deep, resonating ache, a profound sorrow that reached down into the very foundation of my soul. Camille had been a woman of boundless grace. She had welcomed Bradley into this family with open arms. She had baked him cakes on his birthdays, overlooked his arrogant comments at the dinner table, and ultimately convinced me to let him build his extravagant house on our hard-earned land. She gave him the very earth he stood upon, and this was how he repaid her generosity. He threw her legacy into the mud like worthless trash just to score a petty psychological victory over a man he could not defeat legally. I picked up a damp photograph. It showed Camille smiling brightly, holding a newborn Nadine in her arms. Looking at my daughter's innocent infant face, I felt the last lingering thread of my fatherly hesitation snap and dissolve completely. I had held back for weeks. I had played the long game, gathering evidence, building legal traps, and waiting for the right moment to strike. A small, foolish part of my heart had still hoped Nadine would step in, that she would stop her husband from crossing the point of no return. But she had watched from the mansion window while he destroyed her own mother's belongings, and she had done absolutely nothing to stop him. She had chosen her path. They had both chosen their path. Nadine was no longer the little girl in that photograph. She was a grown woman aiding and abetting a criminal who was actively trying to destroy her father. Grief is a powerful emotion, but when it is forged in the fire of utter betrayal, it hardens into something much more dangerous. It hardens into absolute, unyielding vengeance. I wiped the mud from the glass frame of Camille's portrait with a clean towel. I was no longer a grieving widower trying to defend his small corner of the estate. I was the architect of their total destruction. I was going to strip Bradley of his wealth, his pride, and his freedom. I was going to take the mansion he built with stolen money and erase his name from this property forever. And Nadine would learn the harshest lesson a spoiled child could ever receive. She would learn that the safety net she took for granted had just been cut. I dried my hands thoroughly. The shivering stopped. My body was freezing, but my mind was burning with a clear, lethal focus. I walked into the bedroom, changed out of my soaked clothes, and put on dry, warm layers. I did not need to wait for Bradley to make another mistake. He had just made his final one. The time for gathering evidence was officially over. It was time to pull the trigger on the trap we had meticulously set. I walked back into the kitchen, picked up my smartphone, and opened my contacts. I dialed Mr. Kaplan's direct line. He answered on the first ring, his professional tone sharp and immediately alert. "Tyrone, tell me you are all right," he said instantly. "I just received the email with the background check on that fraudulent doctor. The authorities are already looking into his whereabouts. I am perfectly fine, Kaplan," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "But the situation has escalated beyond medical extortion. Bradley just broke into my secondary storage shed. He dragged Camille's personal belongings out into the rain and intentionally destroyed them. He shattered her porcelain and ruined her photographs." I paused, letting the heavy weight of the violations sink in. Kaplan let out a deep, furious sigh on the other end of the line. "I am incredibly sorry, Tyrone. That is a repulsive act of cowardice. It is also the final nail in his coffin," I stated coldly. Section 7 of the ground lease clearly outlines malicious damage to the landowner's primary property. He has officially breached the contract in broad daylight with me watching. I want the ground lease terminated. Not tomorrow, not next week, right now. Kaplan did not hesitate for a single second. "The paperwork is already drafted, Tyrone. I just needed your verbal authorization. I am filing the termination notice with the county court electronically right this second. The land is yours. The physical house is yours. Bradley is officially trespassing on your estate." I ended the call and placed my phone face down on the kitchen counter. I did not even have a moment to pour myself a fresh cup of coffee before a deafening crash shook the entire guest house. The heavy wooden front door blew open, the internal deadbolt splintering the doorframe as Bradley kicked his way inside. He stood in my entryway, his expensive shoes tracking mud across my clean floors. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He marched directly toward me, not stopping until he was mere inches from my face. He raised his hand and violently slapped a single sheet of paper directly onto my chest. I did not flinch. The paper fluttered down and landed on the floor between my boots. "I am done playing games with you, you stubborn old fool!" Bradley screamed, the veins in his neck bulging dangerously. "That is a formal 30-day notice of eviction. You have exactly 1 month to pack your miserable bags and get off my estate. If you are still sitting in this shack on day 30, I will personally drag you out by your collar and throw you into the street. Do you understand me?" I looked down at the paper. It was a generic eviction template printed straight off the internet, completely devoid of any legal authority or court seal. I looked back up at Bradley and smiled. 30 days, I whispered. Enjoy them. The next 30 days became a masterclass in premature celebration. Bradley and Nadine operated under the absolute delusion that handing me a printed piece of paper had cemented their victory. From the windows of my guest house, I watched them transform the estate into their personal playground of arrogance. By day 5, they were already parading high-end commercial contractors across the frozen lawn. Bradley walked with his chest puffed out, pointing aggressively at my roofline while unrolling large blueprints across the hood of his SUV. I could hear his booming voice echoing through the crisp winter air, bragging to a man in a hard hat about how quickly they were going to bulldoze my home to make way for a luxury pool house and a custom tennis court. Nadine was right beside him, holding a steaming cup of coffee, nodding enthusiastically at every destructive idea he pitched. She took photographs of the flower beds Camille had planted, discussing how much better the property would look once everything was ripped out and paved over with modern concrete. They hosted celebratory dinners almost every night, the glow of the mansion windows illuminating their champagne toasts. They laughed loudly on the back patio, completely unfazed by the fact that their supposed victory meant rendering her father homeless. They were actively dancing on the grave of my marriage and my legacy, entirely blind to the trap that had already snapped shut around their ankles. While they celebrated their imaginary triumph outside, I remained perfectly calm inside. I did not waste a single second of those 30 days arguing with them. I did not beg for an extension. I did not make angry phone calls or threaten them with retaliation. I gave them exactly what they wanted to see. I gave them the illusion of absolute defeat. I went to the local hardware store and purchased a dozen heavy-duty moving boxes, making sure to carry them across the driveway right when Bradley was watching from his balcony. I wanted him to witness my submission. I wanted him to feel the intoxicating rush of unchecked power. Inside the guest house, my packing process was not a retreat. It was the meticulous preparation of a battlefield. When you know a massive explosion is about to detonate inside your own home, you secure your most precious assets first. I started with Camille's remaining belongings, the items Bradley had not managed to ruin in his mud-soaked tantrum. I carefully wrapped her vintage jewelry, her handwritten recipe cards, and the fragile ornaments we had collected during our road trips decades ago. I placed them into thick waterproof containers and drove them to a secure, climate-controlled storage facility downtown. I refused to let my wife's memory become collateral damage when the authorities finally stormed the estate. Next, I secured my financial documents, the original land deed, my birth certificate, and the physical hard drives containing every piece of video and audio evidence I had gathered. I left the guest house looking intentionally sparse and hollow. I took down the paintings from the walls, leaving pale rectangular shadows on the paint. I rolled up the heavy Persian rugs. I dismantled the guest room bed frame. Every time Nadine walked past my window to get to her car, she saw a house being systematically stripped down to its bare bones. One afternoon on day 15, she actually knocked on my door. I opened it to find her holding a small plate of cookies. She offered a tight, uncomfortable smile, her eyes darting past me to look at the stacked brown boxes in my living room. "Dad," she said softly, shifting her weight from foot to foot. "I see you are getting ready. I just want you to know this is for the best. Bradley has found a really nice senior living apartment complex across town. We can help you cover the security deposit if you need it." I looked at the plate of cookies, a pitiful, inexpensive peace offering meant to soothe her own lingering guilt. She wanted to throw me out on the street, but she wanted to feel like a good daughter while doing it. I did not take the plate. I simply looked her in the eye and spoke with absolute clarity. "Do not worry about my deposit, Nadine. I have secured exactly the future I deserve, and you have secured exactly the future you deserve." I closed the door quietly in her face, leaving her standing alone on the porch. That was the last time we spoke during the countdown. I spent the remaining days sitting in my worn leather armchair, drinking my coffee and watching the clock tick down to their absolute ruin. I felt no anxiety. I felt no fear. I only felt the cold, unwavering patience of a man who knew the game was already over. My house was empty, but my arsenal was fully loaded. On day 25, I sat at my bare kitchen table with my laptop open, reviewing the final encrypted dossier sent over by Mr. Kaplan. The legal machinery was operating flawlessly. Kaplan had officially filed the ground lease termination notice with the county courts, citing irrefutable evidence of malicious property damage and felony document forgery. Because Bradley had used a suspended notary to file his fake power of attorney, the county clerk had immediately flagged the entire transaction. The local authorities were already quietly building a criminal fraud case against him. But the most devastating document in Kaplan's file was a highly confidential banking alert. The $200,000 mortgage Bradley had illegally taken out against my land was officially in catastrophic default. He had missed his second consecutive payment. The bank's automated fraud department had caught wind of the title discrepancy we reported. They realized they had issued a massive loan based on a completely forged signature, meaning their massive loan was entirely unsecured. Banks do not forgive unsecured fraud. They operate with ruthless speed to protect their capital. Kaplan highlighted a specific paragraph at the bottom of his email. The bank has initiated aggressive foreclosure protocols, Tyrone. They are bypassing the standard grace periods due to the confirmed criminal fraud. The hammer drops this week. I closed my laptop, a sharp smile forming on my face. Everything was perfectly aligned. The legal trap had sealed shut, and Bradley was completely oblivious. On the morning of day 28, the crisp winter air was shattered by the arrival of a sleek, unmarked black sedan. It parked directly in front of the main mansion. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out holding a thick, bright red manila envelope. He did not knock politely. He pounded on the heavy oak double doors with the authority of a federal agent. Bradley answered the door in his silk pajamas, looking annoyed at the interruption. The man handed Bradley the envelope, spoke 2 brief sentences, and walked briskly back to his car. I watched from my kitchen window as Bradley tore the envelope open. It took exactly 10 seconds for the blood to completely drain from his face. The official foreclosure and fraud notice had arrived. He stumbled backward, dropping his morning coffee mug. It shattered across the expensive brick walkway, sending hot liquid splashing over his designer slippers. Bradley sprinted back inside the mansion, slamming the heavy door shut. Less than a minute later, the absolute chaos began. I could hear muffled, frantic screaming echoing through the thick walls of the main house. Nadine's voice pitched high in pure, unadulterated panic, clashing violently with Bradley's desperate, roaring excuses. The celebratory illusion had just been violently ripped away. They were drowning, and they had absolutely no idea that I was the one who had opened the floodgates. Day 30 dawned crisp, bright, and utterly unforgiving. I sat at my bare kitchen table, my coat already on, sipping black coffee from a paper cup. The last 2 days had been a symphony of muffled screaming and slamming doors from the main house. I knew Bradley was desperate. The bank had cornered him, and he was a drowning man thrashing for any available life raft. Precisely at 8 o'clock in the morning, my front door flew open. Bradley marched in, but he was no longer the manicured titan of industry who had threatened me 30 days prior. His eyes were bloodshot. His designer shirt was wrinkled, and he reeked of stale scotch and raw panic. Nadine stood behind him, looking pale and terrified, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Bradley slammed his fist down onto my kitchen table, rattling my coffee cup. "The 30 days are up, old man," he barked, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. It sounded strained, desperate. "You are out of time. I need $1,555 transferred into my account right this second, or you are grabbing your boxes and walking out those gates. You can stay here for free if you pay, but if you do not, you find somewhere else immediately." Nadine looked away, unable to meet my gaze. She was still complicit, still hoping I would magically bail them out of a disaster she could not fully comprehend. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I placed the paper cup down and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an executioner who had just been handed the signed warrant. "You are offering to let me stay on my own property?" I asked, my tone completely conversational. Bradley gritted his teeth, his patience snapping. "I am offering to not throw you into the freezing street if you pay your rent. This is my estate. I built the house. I control the property. Pay the money, Tyrone. Now." I reached down to the floor beside my boot and picked up the heavy black leather folder I had prepared the night before. I placed it gently onto the table between us. "Let us talk about whose name is actually on that land deed, Bradley," I said, flipping the leather cover open. I pulled out a crisp, certified copy of the master deed and slid it across the table. Bradley looked down at it, his bloodshot eyes scanning the bold, official print. The property lines were clearly drawn, encompassing the entire 5 acres, including the ground directly beneath his massive luxury mansion. and there listed as the sole exclusive owner of the land was my name, Tyrone Jenkins. Bradley scoffed, though his hands began to tremble. This does not mean anything, he spat, tapping the paper. I built the house. I filed a power of attorney. I have full administrative control over this entire parcel. You filed a forged power of attorney, I corrected him, my voice slicing through the room like a razor. You hired a disgraced, suspended notary to stamp a fake document so you could illegally take out a $200,000 mortgage against my dirt. You used that stolen money to pay off your failing business debts and to lease a Porsche Cayenne for your mistress, Crystal Davenport. Nadine gasped loudly. Her head snapped toward Bradley, her eyes wide with shock. A Porsche? For who? Bradley froze, the color draining from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The illusion of his absolute control evaporated in a single second. But that is not even the best part. I continued smoothly, pulling the original ground lease from my folder and laying it next to the deed. 5 years ago, Camille and I allowed you to build on our land. You own the bricks, Bradley. But I own the dirt. And according to Section 7 of this legally binding contract, any act of fraud, criminal activity, or malicious damage to my property results in the immediate cancellation of the lease. I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto his terrified face. When you forged my signature to defraud a federal bank, and when you dragged my dead wife's belongings into the mud to terrorize me, you triggered that clause. I filed the cancellation notice with the county court 3 weeks ago. It was finalized and approved yesterday. I do not owe you a single dime of rent, Bradley. You are trespassing on my land. Because the lease is void, the physical structure of your mansion now belongs entirely to the landowner. It belongs to me. Nadine stumbled backward, bumping into the doorframe. Dad, what are you saying? She whispered, her voice trembling. I am saying that your husband has lost everything, Nadine, I replied without breaking eye contact with Bradley. I am saying that the bank foreclosure notice he received 2 days ago was not a mistake. It was the direct result of the bank realizing his loan was unsecured because his collateral was based on a felony forgery. Every single brick, every imported tile, and every square foot of that house now legally belongs to me. You do not have a mansion. You do not have an estate. You are squatters. Bradley stared at the documents on the table, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I could see the gears in his head grinding desperately, searching for a loophole, a lie, any possible way out of the trap. But there was nothing. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the legal reality crushed him. The forged power of attorney he had bet his entire life on was completely useless. It was not just void. It was the exact piece of evidence the authorities were currently using to build a federal bank fraud case against him. His grandiose plan to evict me, sell the 5 acres, and run away with Crystal to start a new life was entirely dead. He was bankrupt. He was exposed as an adulterer to his wife. He had lost the multi-million-dollar mansion he had built his entire ego around. And worst of all, he was facing inevitable prison time. The absolute realization that he had been completely outsmarted by the elderly man he had mocked as a deaf, half-blind groundskeeper broke his mind. He looked at the land deed, then at the canceled ground lease, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. The arrogant king of the estate was reduced to a pathetic, cornered animal in a matter of minutes. A low, guttural sound erupted from Bradley's chest. It was not a word. It was a raw sound of absolute, unhinged denial. In his fractured state of mind, he somehow convinced himself that if he destroyed the physical papers sitting on my kitchen table, the legal reality would simply cease to exist. His eyes locked onto the black leather folder containing the master deed and the ground lease. "You think you can take my house from me?" he roared, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You think you can take my life?" Bradley lunged forward across the small wooden table. He swept his arm violently, sending my coffee cup crashing to the floor, splashing cold black liquid across the hardwood. He clawed at the documents, his fingers grasping wildly for the deed. But I anticipated the violent outburst of a cornered coward. As he lunged, his entire body weight committed forward, leaving him completely unbalanced. He scrambled to rip the documents, his face twisted in pure, savage desperation, determined to shred the evidence of his own destruction into pieces. He roared again, a wild, feral scream as he grabbed the edge of the leather folder, preparing to tear it apart in a frenzy of violent rage. I simply slid my chair backward, allowing the sheer momentum of his furious, uncontrolled lunge to completely betray him. Bradley crashed heavily onto the solid hardwood table, his hands grasping empty air where the black leather folder had been resting just a second before. I had already snatched the critical documents, holding them safely by my side. He scrambled awkwardly, knocking over 2 wooden chairs, gasping for breath as he desperately tried to regain his footing on the slick floor. His face was purple with unhinged rage. I did not raise my voice. I did not scramble away in fear. I calmly reached into my winter coat pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and dialed 911. The emergency operator answered immediately. "I need police assistance at my residence," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and professional. "I have a violent intruder actively destroying my property and threatening my life. He is currently trespassing on my private estate, and he is becoming increasingly dangerous." Bradley froze. The word intruder echoed sharply in the small kitchen. He stared at me, his chest heaving slowly, realizing the absolute gravity of the telephone call. "I am not an intruder," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "This is my house. You cannot call the cops on me." I gave the operator my exact address and ended the call. "You are standing on my land, Bradley," I stated coldly. "The authorities are on their way right now." The flashing red and blue lights of 2 patrol cruisers reflected vividly off the frost-covered windows of my guest house less than 10 minutes later. The heavy, rhythmic footsteps of 3 uniformed officers crunched loudly across the frozen lawn. Bradley immediately bolted for the door, throwing it wide open to intercept them before they could even knock. He desperately tried to reclaim his stolen authority, puffing out his chest and smoothing his wrinkled designer suit jacket. "Officers, thank goodness you are here," Bradley shouted, waving them inside with frantic energy. "There is a massive misunderstanding. I am the owner of this entire estate. My father-in-law is experiencing a severe mental breakdown. He is deeply confused, agitated, and making false emergency calls. I need him escorted off the property immediately for his own safety and for mine." The lead officer, a tall, imposing man with a stern, no-nonsense expression, stepped cautiously into my kitchen. He looked from Bradley, who was sweating profusely and visibly shaking, to me, standing calmly by the counter with a black leather folder tucked securely under my arm. "Who made the emergency call?" the officer asked, resting a heavy hand on his duty belt. "I did, officer," I replied smoothly. "My name is Tyrone Jenkins. I am the sole legal owner of this 5-acre estate, including the very dirt this man is currently standing on. He is trespassing, he is engaged in federal bank fraud, and he just attempted a physical assault." Bradley let out a hysterical, mocking laugh that bordered on manic. "That is a complete lie. Look at the massive main mansion out there. I built that house. My name is on the mortgage. He is a delusional old man who flatly refuses to pay his rent. I did not engage in a petty shouting match. Shouting is for men who severely lack leverage. I simply opened my leather folder and handed the lead officer the certified master deed. "Please review the registered owner of this parcel," I said softly. The officer scanned the official document. His eyes flicked up to Bradley. "The deed is registered exclusively to Mr. Jenkins," the officer stated. Bradley sputtered, pointing aggressively at me. "We have a ground lease. I hold a power of attorney. He is legally incapacitated. He is actively trying to steal my home." I handed the officer the second document. "That is the original ground lease he mentioned," I explained calmly. "However, you will notice the attached court order from the county clerk. The lease was formally voided and legally terminated yesterday due to documented malicious damage and felony forgery." I then handed the officer a tablet I had prepared precisely for this moment. "Furthermore, this man claims I am mentally incapacitated and a danger. Please press play on that video." The 3 officers crowded closely around the screen. They watched the crystal-clear, high-definition security footage from days ago showing Bradley violently shoving me to the frozen ground during his fancy investor party. They watched Nadine rush over not to help me but to lie to the wealthy guests about my mental health. They watched Bradley physically assault a senior citizen without a single ounce of provocation. The atmosphere in the kitchen shifted instantly. The officers' postures stiffened. The benefit of the doubt Bradley was desperately clinging to vanished completely into thin air. "He shoved you to the ground," the lead officer said, looking directly at Bradley with sheer disgust. "He provoked me." Bradley screamed, backing away toward the kitchen wall. "He is manipulating the paperwork. This is a setup. You cannot listen to him. I am a wealthy man. I own that mansion. You cannot do this to me." The lead officer handed the tablet back to me and turned his full attention directly to Bradley. "Sir, the legal documentation presented here is absolute and verified by the county court. You do not own this land. Your lease has been legally terminated by a judge. By standing inside this guest house after being explicitly ordered to leave, you are actively trespassing on private property." "But the house," Bradley stammered, his eyes darting frantically between the 3 armed officers. I took out a $200,000 loan against this property. The bank recognizes my authority. The second officer pulled out a small notepad. Did you secure that massive loan using a power of attorney document? He asked sharply. Yes, Bradley shouted, clinging to his own confession like a desperate lifeline. I have administrative control. I stepped forward. He secured that loan using a forged signature officer. The notary he used had a suspended license. The bank has already issued a foreclosure notice because they realized the loan was entirely unsecured. He committed wire fraud to fund a luxury vehicle for his mistress. The officers exchanged a heavy, knowing look, trespassing assault on a senior citizen and a blatant admission of leveraging property. You do not legally own, the lead officer stated, his voice dropping an octave. Sir, you have just admitted to severe financial crimes in the presence of law enforcement. Bradley took another step back, his shoulders hitting the kitchen wall with a heavy thud. He looked exactly like a trapped animal. No, 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 he muttered, shaking his head rapidly. You are not arresting me. I have highly paid lawyers. I will sue this entire department. I will sue you, Tyrone. I will completely destroy you. The lead officer did not entertain another single word. He stepped forward swiftly, grabbing Bradley by the arm and spinning him around with professional force. Place your hands behind your back, he ordered firmly. Bradley tried to pull away, but the second officer instantly pinned his other arm. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting securely around Bradley's wrists echoed beautifully through my kitchen. He was entirely neutralized. Just as the officers began reciting his Miranda rights, the front door burst open. Nadine ran inside, her face completely drained of color, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She had finally emerged from the main house, drawn out by the flashing police lights illuminating her living room. Bradley, Nadine screamed, her voice tearing through the small room. What is happening? Why are they putting you in handcuffs? Dad, what did you do? Tell them to stop right now. Bradley thrashed against the officer's iron grip, his face twisted in absolute agony. Do something, Nadine, he roared desperately. Call the lawyers. Get me out of here. He is stealing our house. I stood perfectly still, watching my daughter stare at the wreckage of her entire life. Nadine lunged towards me, her hands grasping desperately at the sleeves of my heavy winter coat. Dad, please, she sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of her sheer panic. Tell them to stop right now. Tell them it is all a massive misunderstanding. You cannot let them take him away in handcuffs. He is my husband. He is the father of your future grandchildren. Whatever he did, whatever money he supposedly owes you, we will pay it back. I promise you. Just tell the officers you made a mistake and drop the charges. I looked down at her hands, clutching my coat. She was trembling violently, completely unable to process the reality unfolding in front of her. She truly believed this was just a petty family squabble over unpaid rent. She honestly thought a simple apology could erase federal fraud, physical assault, and absolute betrayal. The officers were already marching Bradley toward the front door, his protests growing weaker as the reality of a prison cell loomed closer. Dad, say something, Nadine pleaded, dropping to her knees on the hardwood floor, her tears spilling hot and fast. You are destroying our family over a piece of land. I will sign whatever you want. I will make him apologize. Please do not do this to me. Do not let them lock him up. I did not pull away from her grasp, nor did I comfort her. You are not losing a husband, Nadine, I stated evenly. You are losing a parasite, and I am not destroying your family. I am simply exposing it. Nadine stared up at me, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated denial. A parasite. She repeated, her voice shaking with indignant, misguided rage. How can you say that to me? He has worked tirelessly for us. He built that beautiful house from the ground up. He has been under so much extreme stress trying to keep everything together, and you are treating him like a common criminal. He loves me, Dad. He would never do anything to intentionally hurt us or abandon this family. I let out a slow, measured breath. Delusion is a powerful anesthetic, but the truth is a surgical scalpel. It cuts incredibly deep, but it removes the rot. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the bright screen, navigating to the secure cloud folder where I had meticulously stored every single piece of evidence. I selected the audio file I had recorded from the shadows of my porch just a few days prior. You think your husband has been working late at the office to secure your financial future? I said, turning the volume on my phone all the way up to maximum. Listen very closely to how he speaks when he thinks nobody is paying attention to the deaf, half-blind groundskeeper. I pressed play. The crystal-clear audio filled the freezing kitchen. Crystal's sharp nasal whine echoed off the walls. I am tired of waiting, Bradley. The creditors are calling my phone now because my name is on that car lease. You promised me this estate would be liquidated by the 15th. It is either me or your miserable wife and that stubborn old man. You have exactly 3 days to kick him off this property and finalize the sale, or I am walking away and sending all the financial records straight to your sweet, clueless Nadine." Nadine froze completely. The blood vanished from her face. Her grip on my coat loosened entirely, her hands falling limply to her sides. Then Bradley's frantic, pleading voice played from the small speaker. "I am handling it, Crystal. The eviction is already in motion. The old man will be gone by Friday, I swear. Just give me 72 hours to force him out." I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was utterly suffocating. Nadine remained kneeling on the floor, her eyes wide and completely hollow. Her mouth opened and closed silently like a fish pulled from the water. I did not let her look away. "That is Crystal Davenport," I stated coldly. "The mistress your husband has been parading around this property while you were downtown working 50 hours a week. That $200,000 mortgage he illegally took out against my land using a forged signature was not used to save his company. He used it to pay for her luxury lifestyle. He leased her a brand new Porsche Cayenne for exactly $1,555 a month. The exact amount he tried to extort from me this morning under the guise of rent." Nadine let out a strangled, breathless gasp. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth. "He never intended to save your marriage, Nadine," I continued, ensuring every word struck its target. "He was planning to leverage the entire estate, sell the dirt right out from under you, take the cash payout, and run off with Crystal. He was setting you up to take the fall for his massive credit card debts and his fraudulent bank loans. He was going to leave you entirely homeless, legally ruined, and completely alone." Nadine collapsed backward onto the floor, her entire body shaking as the crushing weight of her husband's absolute betrayal shattered her manufactured reality. But her overwhelming grief quickly mutated into a desperate, defensive anger. She looked up at me, her eyes flashing with sudden, bitter resentment. "If you knew all of this, why did you not tell me immediately?" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "Why did you let me believe everything was perfectly fine? You sat there and watched me worry about our future. You watched me try to mediate between you two. You could have stopped this weeks ago and saved me from this humiliation." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity for her situation. "I did not hide the truth from you, Nadine. You actively chose to ignore it because the illusion of your wealthy, perfect lifestyle was vastly more important to you than my basic dignity. You want to know exactly why I did not warn you." I stepped closer, forcing her to look up at my unyielding expression. "Because yesterday your husband dragged your deceased mother's personal belongings out of the storage shed and threw them into the freezing rain. He shattered her delicate porcelain and ruined her cherished photographs simply to terrorize me. And I watched you stand comfortably in the window of that mansion holding a cup of coffee, and you did absolutely nothing to stop him. You chose your side right then and there." Nadine flinched violently, covering her face as a fresh wave of agonizing sobs wrecked her body. She knew she had no viable defense. She had completely traded her family loyalty for a fraudulent crown, and now she was left with absolutely nothing. I stepped around her, walking toward the open front door where the police cruisers had just pulled away, taking the architect of her misery to a federal holding cell. "The ground lease is legally terminated," I stated, my voice echoing through the kitchen with absolute finality. "The physical structure of that mansion has reverted entirely to the landowner. That means I own every single brick of the house you are currently sleeping in. Since you are completely tied to your husband's massive financial debts, I know you cannot afford to buy it back or pay me a single dime of fair market value." I pointed a firm finger toward the main gates of the estate. "You are no longer welcome on my property. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your clothes, gather your personal items, and vacate the premises entirely. Do not try to take any fixtures or appliances because they belong to me now. If you are still standing on my dirt by tomorrow morning, I will call those exact same officers back here and have you arrested for trespassing. Now get out of my sight." The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse swung shut, sealing off the noisy hallway and plunging the courtroom into a tense, echoing silence. It had been exactly 3 weeks since the police dragged my son-in-law off my estate in handcuffs. I sat comfortably at the plaintiff table, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit. Across the aisle sat Bradley. He had somehow managed to scrape together enough cash to post bail, likely draining the very last drops of his maxed-out credit cards, or begging his final few associates for a desperate loan. But freedom was a temporary illusion for a man backed into a legal corner. Instead of preparing for his impending federal criminal trial, Bradley had chosen to double down on his arrogance. He had filed an emergency civil lawsuit against me demanding absolute possession of the physical mansion he had built on my land. He sat rigidly next to a cheap, overworked public defender, his designer suit hanging loosely on his thinning frame. The stress of impending ruin had aged him a decade in just 21 days. He refused to look in my direction, keeping his bloodshot eyes glued to the judge's empty bench. He genuinely believed that because he paid for the bricks and the drywall, the court would force me to compensate him for the structure, or allow him to dismantle it piece by piece. He thought he could salvage a few $100,000 to fund a legal defense and orchestrate his escape. He was completely wrong. The Honorable Judge Harrison entered the courtroom, taking her seat at the high mahogany bench with a swift, no-nonsense strike of her gavel. She was a stern woman with decades of experience in property law, entirely immune to the emotional theatrics Bradley was relying upon. Bradley's overworked attorney stood up first, fumbling with a disorganized stack of papers. He launched into a frantic, rambling argument about unjust enrichment. He claimed that because his client had secured the initial construction loan and paid for the physical erection of the luxury mansion, seizing the structure without massive financial compensation was a blatant violation of property rights. He argued that the court should grant Bradley the immediate right to either sell the physical house to a third party to repay his massive debts or force me to buy the structure at fair market value. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to extract cash from a stone. When the defense attorney finally sat down out of breath and sweating, Mr. Kaplan stood up from my table. He did not rush. He buttoned his suit jacket, adjusted his glasses, and approached the podium with the lethal, predatory calm of a great white shark. "Your Honor," Kaplan began, his deep baritone voice effortlessly commanding the entire courtroom. "The plaintiff's argument regarding unjust enrichment is entirely fundamentally flawed because it completely ignores the explicit legally binding contractual parameters under which that structure was built." Kaplan placed a single crisp folder onto the podium. He pulled out the original ground lease Camille and I had signed 5 years ago and handed a certified copy to the bailiff to deliver to the judge. The structure in question was built on land exclusively owned by my client Tyrone Jenkins, under a strict 99-year ground lease, Kaplan stated clearly. Section 7 of that exact lease contains an ironclad forfeiture clause. It explicitly states that any documented act of fraud, malicious destruction of the landowner's primary property, or criminal activity committed by the lessee results in the immediate termination of the agreement. Kaplan turned slightly, locking his piercing gaze directly onto Bradley. Furthermore, well-established state property law regarding fixtures dictates that once a ground lease is legally voided through the fault of the tenant, any permanent structure affixed to the land automatically and irrevocably reverts to the sole ownership of the landowner. There is no buyout. There is no equity split. The building simply becomes part of the dirt. Bradley jumped up from his chair, his face turning an angry, mottled purple. "I paid for that house," he shouted, completely ignoring courtroom decorum. "I took out the loans. You cannot just steal a multi-million-dollar property because of a technicality." The judge slammed her gavel down instantly, her eyes flashing with sharp warning. "Sit down and remain silent, or I will hold you in contempt of court," she ordered sharply. Bradley sank back into his chair, his chest heaving with uncontrolled panic. Kaplan did not even blink at the outburst. He simply pulled out the second piece of evidence. "Your Honor, my client did not terminate this lease over a minor technicality. The lessee, Bradley, deliberately forged my client's signature on a fraudulent power of attorney document. He then used that forged document to illegally secure a $200,000 mortgage against my client's land. That is active, documented federal bank fraud. We have already submitted the forged documents, the police reports from his physical assault on my client, and the verified bank foreclosure notices into evidence. The lease is dead. The house belongs entirely to Tyrone Jenkins." I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff table, my hands folded neatly together, watching the absolute destruction of the man who had tried to ruin my life. Bradley looked like a deflated balloon. The swaggering corporate titan who had once marched into my guest house demanding $1,555 a month was completely gone. In his place sat a broken, terrified criminal, realizing there was absolutely no escape from the consequences of his own overwhelming greed. His cheap public defender was aggressively whispering in his ear, likely explaining that fighting this mountain of irrefutable evidence was completely suicidal. Bradley dragged his hands down his pale, sweat-slicked face. He looked over at me, his eyes wide and pleading silently, begging for a shred of the mercy he had so brutally denied my late wife and me. I gave him absolutely nothing. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply held his gaze with eyes as cold and unforgiving as winter ice. I wanted him to feel the exact suffocating weight of total powerlessness. I wanted him to understand that all his manipulation, all his shouting, and all his expensive suits meant absolutely nothing against a man who possessed patience, discipline, and the undeniable truth. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of wealth, and I was watching that illusion burn to ash in a sterile county courtroom. Judge Harrison spent less than 2 minutes reviewing the certified documents Mr. Kaplan had submitted. She closed the file, adjusted her reading glasses, and glared down at Bradley with a look of profound judicial disgust. "The legal precedent here is entirely unambiguous," the judge stated, her voice ringing out like a death knell. "The ground lease is officially voided due to gross documented contractual violations and active criminal fraud. The physical structure known as the main estate house is hereby awarded in its entirety to the legal landowner Tyrone Jenkins. The plaintiff's request for financial compensation is denied with extreme prejudice." Before Bradley could even process the devastating ruling, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 2 federal agents in dark suits walked swiftly down the center aisle, presenting their badges to the bailiff. Bradley's bail conditions were contingent on state-level assault and trespassing charges. However, the federal investigation into the fraudulent $200,000 mortgage had just concluded. The judge struck her gavel a final time. "Bradley, your state bail is hereby revoked. You are remanded into federal custody effective immediately, pending formal indictment for wire fraud and bank fraud. Court is adjourned." The agents grabbed Bradley by both arms, hauling him forcefully out of his chair. He did not scream this time. He just wept quietly as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked securely around his wrists. The heavy iron gates of my estate were firmly locked against the bitter winter wind. I was sitting in my guest house kitchen, a warm cup of coffee in my hands, when the intercom buzzer near the front door began blaring with frantic, unrelenting urgency. I checked the security camera feed on my tablet. Nadine was standing outside the main gate. She was not wearing her usual tailored corporate attire. She was wrapped in a cheap, oversized coat, shivering violently against the freezing wind, clutching a single battered canvas duffel bag. Her luxury SUV was nowhere in sight. She looked entirely broken. She hammered her bare fists against the wrought iron bars, shouting something I could not hear over the howling wind, but her desperate, tear-streaked face told the entire story. Bradley's immediate federal incarceration had triggered a catastrophic financial avalanche. The joint bank accounts she shared with her husband were undoubtedly frozen by federal investigators. The massive, fraudulent credit card debts Bradley had racked up were now legally anchored around her neck. She had no husband, no home, and absolutely no money. She had hit absolute rock bottom, and she had come crawling back to the only safety net she had ever known. I set my coffee cup down. I did not rush to the intercom. I did not buzz the gate open to welcome her into the warmth of my home. I put on my heavy winter coat, walked out onto the frozen driveway, and made the long, slow walk down to the front gates. Nadine saw me approaching and instantly gripped the iron bars tighter, pressing her face against the cold metal. "Dad," she sobbed, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Dad, please open the gate. My cards are all declining. The feds froze our accounts. I cannot even book a cheap motel room. I have absolutely nowhere else to go. Please, I know I was wrong. I know I should have stopped him. Just let me come inside." I stopped exactly 3 feet from the gate, keeping the thick iron bars securely between us. I did not reach out to comfort her. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a single, perfectly crisp cashier's check I had prepared at the bank 3 days prior. I slid the paper through the narrow gap in the iron bars. Nadine let go of the gate and snatched the check, her eyes scanning the numbers through her tears. She looked up, her expression shifting from desperate hope to profound confusion. $1,555, she whispered, her voice trembling. "That is exactly 1 month of rent for a very cheap basic apartment on the south side of the city." I stated, my voice completely devoid of any parental warmth. "It is exactly the amount of money your husband tried to extort from me to fund his mistress's luxury sports car. And it is the absolute last dime you will ever receive from me for the rest of your natural life." Nadine stared at the check, her hand shaking so violently the paper fluttered in the wind. "Dad, no," she pleaded, fresh tears spilling down her pale cheeks. "You cannot do this. You cannot just leave me out here. I am your daughter. I am all you have left." I looked at her, truly looked at her, and felt the final heavy chain of obligation break and fall away. You stopped being my daughter the moment you stood in that mansion window and watched your husband throw your deceased mother's cherished belongings into the freezing mud. I said, my voice cutting through the winter air like a blade. You made a conscious, calculated choice. You chose a fraudulent, stolen lifestyle over your own father. You stood in front of those investors and called me a delusional lunatic. You were perfectly willing to let your husband throw me onto the street. And now you are standing on the street. This is not a punishment, Nadine. This is simply the consequence of your own absolute arrogance. But I have nothing, she screamed, her voice bordering on hysteria. Bradley ruined me. I have hundreds of thousands of dollars in joint debt. I am going to have to file for bankruptcy. Then you better start filling out the paperwork, I replied coldly, because I am not paying a single cent of your debt. I am not rescuing you. I am not fixing this. I spent 35 years fixing your mistakes, and it turned you into an entitled, complicit monster. You are 35 years old. It is time you finally learn how to survive on your own. Take the check, Nadine. Find a cheap apartment, get a second job, and figure it out. Because if you come back to this gate again, I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. I turned my back on her and began the long walk back up the driveway. Dad, she screamed, slamming her fists against the iron bars. You cannot just abandon me. Dad. I did not turn around. I did not hesitate. I walked back inside my guest house, locked the heavy front door, and took off my winter coat. I stood by the kitchen window and watched the security feed on my tablet. Nadine stood at the gate for another 20 minutes, crying and holding onto the iron bars, desperately hoping I would change my mind. When the freezing wind finally broke her resolve, she picked up her battered canvas bag, clutched the check tightly in her frozen hand, and began the long, humiliating walk down the barren road toward the city bus stop. Watching my only child walk away into the cold, harsh reality of the world was incredibly painful. A father's instinct is to protect, to shield, to absorb the blow. But I had finally realized that shielding a parasite only ensures that the parasite grows stronger. Camille had shielded Nadine from every consequence, and it had forged a woman capable of watching her own mother's legacy be destroyed for a quick payout. Cutting Nadine off completely was the most agonizing decision of my life, but it was also the absolute most necessary. I was not abandoning her. I was forcing her to finally grow up. I turned off the security feed and walked back to the kitchen table. The estate was finally quiet. The toxic presence that had infected my family was completely gone. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, feeling a profound, heavy closure settle over my heart. The peace lasted exactly 48 hours before a sleek silver corporate sedan pulled through the open front gates and parked directly in front of the main mansion. I watched from the guest house porch as 3 men in sharp navy blue suits stepped out. They carried thick leather portfolios and heavy-duty padlocks. They were not investors. They were asset recovery agents dispatched by the federal bank to officially seize the property related to Bradley's fraudulent $200,000 mortgage. The lead agent marched confidently up the brick walkway toward the grand double doors of the mansion, pulling a bright orange foreclosure notice from his portfolio. I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing and walked across the frozen lawn to intercept them. Gentlemen, I called out, my voice steady and authoritative. You can save your padlocks and your foreclosure notices. You are trespassing on private property and you have absolutely no legal right to secure that building. The lead agent turned, his expression hardening into a look of professional impatience. He sized up my flannel shirt and work boots, clearly assuming I was just a confused groundskeeper. Sir, he said, his tone clipped and aggressive. We represent the primary lender. We have a federal mandate to seize this asset due to massive loan default and documented wire fraud committed by the former owner, Bradley Thomas. This property is now under bank jurisdiction. I suggest you step aside and let us secure the premises. I did not step aside. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the certified court order signed by Judge Harrison just 3 days prior, and handed it directly to the lead agent. Bradley Thomas has never been the owner of this property, I stated firmly. And your bank's $200,000 mortgage is completely unsecured because he secured it using a forged signature. Read the judge's ruling. The ground lease is legally voided. The physical structure of that mansion belongs entirely to the legal landowner. And that landowner is me. The lead agent stared at the certified court order in his trembling hands, the color completely draining from his rigid face. He read Judge Harrison's signature twice, swallowed hard, and immediately lowered his bright orange foreclosure notice. Without uttering another word of arrogant defiance, he turned on his heel, signaled his men, and drove off my property. Less than 4 hours later, Mr. Kaplan and I were seated in a sprawling glass-walled conference room on the top floor of the bank's downtown corporate headquarters. The atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. We were facing the bank's senior vice president, a sweating, red-faced executive named Prescott, along with a team of 3 frantic corporate attorneys. Prescott attempted to salvage his disastrous position by leaning heavily on aggressive corporate bluster. He slammed his hand on the polished mahogany table, loudly claiming that despite the forged land deed, the bank still held a massive equitable interest in the physical structure itself. He threatened to tie my estate up in endless civil litigation until I was forced to sell the land just to pay my legal fees. I did not flinch. I sat perfectly still in my tailored suit, letting his desperate threats echo into the sterile room. Mr. Kaplan simply adjusted his glasses, opened his briefcase, and began to systematically dismantle their entire legal defense with ruthless, undeniable precision. The executives slowly realized they were facing an absolute, unmitigated financial catastrophe. Kaplan pointed a sharp finger directly at Prescott, his deep baritone voice cutting through the executive's arrogant posturing. "Your risk management department completely failed its most basic fiduciary duty," Kaplan stated coldly. "You issued a $200,000 mortgage based entirely on a power of attorney notarized by a man whose legal license was publicly revoked for fraud. Your bank financed a federal criminal. If you attempt to press an illegal claim against my client's land, we will not just defeat you in civil court. We will hand this entire fraudulent paper trail over to the Federal Banking Commission." Prescott wiped his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief, his corporate posture completely deflating. The harsh reality of a public federal investigation terrified him far more than losing a single mortgage. The bad press alone would tank their quarterly stock prices and guarantee his immediate termination. He tried to appeal to my sense of reason, suggesting a settlement where the bank would seize the physical house, auction it to a third party to recoup their massive losses, and generously cut me a minor percentage of the final sale. I did not laugh, but my silence was far more punishing. I leaned forward, resting my forearms heavily on the polished glass table. "You are entirely out of your depth, Prescott," I said, making sure he felt the absolute weight of my authority. "You issued a massive loan secured by absolutely nothing. You do not own the bricks, you do not own the dirt, and you certainly do not own me. Your bank made a catastrophic error." The executives exchanged panicked, defeated glances. Kaplan slid a single, crisp document across the glass table. It was not a plea for leniency. It was an aggressive, non-negotiable offer. I am not an unreasonable man. I continued, keeping my eyes locked onto Prescott's sweating face. "I recognize you have a $200,000 black hole on your books that you need to make disappear before your board of directors demands a full audit. I am willing to purchase Bradley's completely unsecured toxic debt, but I am certainly not paying retail for stolen goods." Kaplan tapped the paper sharply. "My client is offering exactly $20,000 to buy the debt in its entirety, completely clearing your books of this fraudulent liability. 10 cents on the dollar. In exchange, the bank signs a total release of lien, formally acknowledging that they hold zero claim, equitable or otherwise, to any structure or land on the Jenkins estate." Prescott scoffed, his face flushing dark red with indignation. $20,000, that is an absolute insult. We will take the total loss and write it off before we accept pennies. "Then write it off," I replied, instantly standing up from my chair and buttoning my suit jacket. "But understand that writing it off means you walk away with zero cash and the absolute certainty that I will report your gross negligence to federal regulators by the end of business today. Let us see how your board feels about your corporate pride then." I turned toward the heavy glass door, my footsteps deliberate. I did not even make it to the handle before Prescott broke. "Wait!" he called out, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. He looked at his legal counsel, who offered a grim, defeated nod. "We accept the offer," Prescott muttered, staring down at his expensive shoes. "We will draft the release of lien immediately." I returned to the estate that afternoon with the signed release of lien securely locked in my leather folder. I walked up the grand brick pathway and unlocked the heavy double doors of the main house. The air inside felt stale, tainted by the lingering arrogance and petty greed of its former occupants. The expansive living room was cluttered with Bradley's gaudy, overpriced modern art and Nadine's superficial designer furniture. It did not feel like a home. It felt like a sterile showroom built to impress strangers. I immediately pulled out my phone and hired a premier heavy-duty commercial cleaning crew. I gave the foreman one specific ruthless directive. I want every single piece of furniture, every imported rug, every painting, and every personal item left behind by the previous tenants completely removed from this property by tomorrow morning. Donate whatever is usable to local charity shelters and drag the rest straight to the county landfill. I watched as a dozen workers descended upon the mansion, systematically stripping away the superficial layers of Bradley and Nadine's toxic existence. I stood in the center of the grand foyer watching the physical manifestations of their entitlement being carried out the front door in heavy garbage bags. The cleansing process was immensely cathartic. I watched a worker carry out the massive overpriced espresso machine Bradley had flaunted at his parties. I watched them dismantle the custom leather sofas where Nadine had sat while ignoring my eviction. I was not just cleaning a house. I was actively erasing their entire parasitic legacy from my hard-earned land. By sunset the next day, the massive mansion was entirely empty. The vast rooms echoed with a clean, peaceful silence that had not existed on this property for 5 years. The hardwood floors shined brightly. The sweeping staircase stood bare and majestic. The toxic rot had been completely excised from the foundation. I walked over to my guest house and carefully retrieved the most precious item I had protected during the 30-day countdown. It was the large hand-painted oil portrait of my beautiful wife Camille. I carried the heavy canvas back across the lawn, the evening winter air feeling surprisingly refreshing against my face. I stepped into the grand foyer of the main house, found the exact center of the highest, most prominent wall, and secured a heavy brass hook firmly into the drywall. I lifted Camille's portrait and set it gently into place. I stepped back, admiring her warm, gentle smile radiating across the expansive, echoing room. The mansion was no longer a monument to a fraud. It was finally a true extension of our family estate. I had fought the hardest, most brutal battle of my life to protect the ground we had built our dreams upon. Looking at her face, I felt a deep, unwavering peace settle into my chest. The war was officially over. I was finally home. 6 months have passed since the afternoon I hung Camille's portrait in the grand foyer. The bitter winter has finally given way to a warm, breathing spring. I am sitting on the expansive second-floor balcony of the main mansion, a steaming mug of black coffee resting comfortably in my hand. The morning sun washes over the 5 acres of lush green grass, illuminating a property that is completely, undeniably mine. There are no corporate contractors pacing the lawn. There are no loud, arrogant parties echoing through the night. The silence that wraps around the estate is profound and deeply healing. It is the sound of absolute peace. I take a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the gentle morning breeze brush against my face. For the first time in years, my shoulders are entirely relaxed. I am no longer a grieving widower, hiding in the shadows of a guest house, tiptoeing around the bloated egos of ungrateful children. I am the master of my own domain. The heavy weight of constant vigilance has been lifted. The air simply tastes cleaner when it is not poisoned by deceit and entitlement. Looking out over the property lines I established decades ago with my own 2 hands, I feel a quiet surge of pride. The storm came, it raged against my foundation, and it broke itself against my resolve. I am still standing. The aftermath of the storm was swift and utterly merciless for those who tried to sink my ship. Bradley is currently sitting in a federal penitentiary wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit that is a far cry from his tailored Italian suits. His trial did not last long. The sheer volume of incontrovertible evidence Mr. Kaplan and I provided to the federal prosecutors left his defense attorneys completely paralyzed. Between the forged notary stamps, the fraudulent $200,000 mortgage, and the blatant wire fraud the judge showed him, absolutely no leniency. Bradley was handed a 10-year mandatory sentence without the possibility of early parole. The irony is staggering. A man who desperately tried to evict me from my own land will now spend the next decade of his life locked inside a tiny concrete box that he does not own. Crystal Davenport, the high-maintenance mistress he blew his stolen fortune on, vanished the second the federal indictments were unsealed. When the luxury Porsche was repossessed and the bank accounts were frozen solid, her so-called loyalty evaporated into thin air. Bradley lost his freedom, his wealth, and his dignity all in one catastrophic sweep. Then there is Nadine. The financial wreckage Bradley left behind buried her completely. Because her name was tied to their joint credit cards and massive lifestyle loans, the debt collectors descended upon her like vultures. She was forced to file for total bankruptcy just to stop the relentless harassment. She lost her expensive corporate wardrobe, her luxury SUV, and her pristine credit score. Last week, Mr. Kaplan mentioned that he saw her working at a big box grocery store on the south side of the city. My 35-year-old daughter, who once looked down her nose at working-class people, is now wearing a polyester vest and scanning barcodes for minimum wage. She stands on her feet for 8 hours a day, dealing with difficult customers, counting out exact change, and learning the brutal, exhausting reality of how the rest of the world survives. A part of my fatherly heart aches knowing she is struggling to afford basic groceries. I remember the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders, the teenager I worked double shifts to put through college. It would be incredibly easy for me to drive down to that supermarket, write her a check, and instantly rescue her from poverty. I could buy her a modest condo and pay her bills, but doing so would undo every single lesson this painful ordeal has taught her. Rescuing her now would only validate her lifelong belief that she is entitled to a permanent safety net regardless of her own atrocious behavior. She needs to feel the ache in her feet after a long shift. She needs to understand the profound panic of budgeting a small paycheck. She needs to build her own character from the rubble of her ruined life. Nadine is finally growing up. It took losing absolutely everything for her to start learning the value of a single dollar and the absolute necessity of personal accountability. I check on her from a distance, making sure she is not in physical danger, but I will never intervene in her financial struggles. The struggle is the exact medicine she needs to cure the disease of her entitlement. With the main mansion now fully restored and serving as my primary residence, the small guest house in the backyard sat completely empty. I no longer needed a secondary dwelling to hide in. Last month, I made a decisive financial move. I hired a specialized architectural salvage crew to carefully dismantle the guest house structure. They sold the reclaimed timber, the fixtures, and the premium appliances. Between the salvage profits and a significant portion of my own retirement savings, I gathered a substantial sum of capital. I took those funds and walked straight into the administrative offices of the local community college. I established a permanent, fully funded endowment. The Camille Jenkins Memorial Scholarship is now an active, functioning reality. Every single year, the scholarship provides full tuition and housing stipends to 3 underprivileged young women from our city who are pursuing degrees in nursing and social work. Instead of watching my wealth be squandered on luxury car leases and designer clothes by ungrateful parasites, I am watching it transform the lives of hardworking students who actually understand the value of an opportunity. Camille dedicated her entire life to nurturing others. This endowment ensures that her spirit of boundless generosity continues to thrive, directed toward people who genuinely deserve it. I receive letters from the scholarship recipients. They write about their dreams, their grueling late-night study sessions, and their profound gratitude. Reading their words brings a warmth to my chest that money alone could never buy. I turned the darkest chapter of my life into a beacon of hope for strangers. The dirt Bradley tried to steal from me essentially paid for the education of future nurses who will spend their lives healing the sick. It is a beautiful, poetic redemption of my estate. I finish the last sip of my coffee as the morning sun fully crests over the tree line. The golden light spills across the grand balcony, warming my skin. I have spent my entire life believing that family is the ultimate unbreakable bond. I believed that shared blood meant shared loyalty. But blood is just biology. True family is forged in mutual respect, unwavering honesty, and shared sacrifice. Being a father does not mean you must willingly lay down and let yourself be consumed by the very children you created. Family is never a valid license for abuse. I look down at my strong, calloused hands. They built this life, and they protected it when it mattered most. The hardest decision a parent can ever make is to stop shielding their child from the fire. But I finally understand the truth. Sometimes the most profound, loving thing you can possibly do for a deeply entitled child is to step aside and let them lose absolutely everything. You have to let their fake castles burn to the ground so they can learn how to lay their own bricks. I am alone on this massive estate, but I am entirely whole. The air is clear, the property is mine, the future belongs to me. I stand up, walk back inside my beautiful, quiet home, and close the glass doors behind me. I also learned that true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the balance in your bank account or the size of the mansion you sleep in. Real wealth is the quiet dignity of an honest life. It is the undeniable ability to look yourself in the mirror and know you never compromised your morals for a quick payout. Bradley thought his forged documents and luxury cars made him a king, but he was nothing but a beggar in a designer suit. True legacy is never simply inherited through blood or stolen through fraud. It is built through relentless resilience and shared only with those who actually earn it. If you found value in my journey today, please leave a comment down below and share this story with anyone who might need the courage to stand up and reclaim their own peace.